Chapter 10, Part 2 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Crossing the Han. Departure of General MacArthur. General Shepard and Admiral Struble witnessed the crossing from a vantage point on the south bank, where they had a good view of the fight for Hill 125. Both accompanied General MacArthur that afternoon when he made a final tour of the front before his departure for Tokyo. The caravan of jeep-borne officers and reporters stopped first at the crossing area, then proceeded to the zone of the 1st Marines, where the battle for Yongdungpo was going on full blast. General MacArthur got out of his jeep and continued on foot along rice paddies where Marines were still flushing out snipers. This meant a period of anxiety for General Smith, which lasted until the responsibility for the safety of the Commander-in-Chief passed to General Barr in the zone of the 7th Infantry Division. On the afternoon of the 21st, the Marine General saw MacArthur off at Kimpo on his plane for Tokyo. Never had the old warrior worn his famous scrambled egg cap with more verve. Barely a week had gone by since the Marines scrambled ashore on red and blue beaches, yet most of the major objectives had already been taken: Inchon, Kimpo, Yongdungpo, the north bank of the Han, and the approaches to Seoul. In the Pusan Perimeter, meanwhile, the 8th Army had been hitting the enemy hard in its joint offensive. This was the score on D+7. But perhaps the famous septuagenarian recalled with pardonable complacency that as late as D-7, the Joint Chiefs of Staff had reiterated doubts of the Inchon Landing which they had expressed on several previous occasions. MacArthur was warned that if the operation failed, the entire United Nations cause in Korea might be plunged into serious difficulties. The Commander-in-Chief replied with superb assurance, "I and all my commanders and staff officers, without exception, are enthusiastic and confident of the success of the enveloping operation." Such confidence could not be withstood. But it was not until 8 September 1950 that the Joint Chiefs of Staff finally acquiesced in an operation they had never entirely approved, an operation scheduled to take place in just 1 week. It may be that Douglas MacArthur was recalling this exchange of views as he stood in the sunlight of Kimpo Airfield, his eyes flashing and his chin out thrust. There is no tonic like victory, and he looked 20 years younger than his actual years as he decorated General Smith with a silver star just before the plane took off. "To the gallant commander of a gallant division," said the Commander-in-Chief by way of citation. Supporting arms of Bridgehead. Even success did not alter the conviction of Navy and Marine amphibious specialists that risks had been assumed in the Inchon Landing which might have resulted in disaster. It was taking no credit away from General MacArthur for his unshakable faith in victory to conclude that fortune had smiled in some instances when a frown would have been costly. The teamwork of Marine supporting arms was never shown to better effect than in the establishment of a bridgehead over the Han. Lieutenant Colonel Partridge's engineers, of course, were on the job from the beginning. It was up to them to get the tanks across the river as soon as possible, in case the infantry needed the support of armor. Approaches and ferry landings had to be constructed for this purpose, and just 6 hours after the initial infantry crossing, the engineers had their first 6-float M4A2 raft in operation. It had taken them 4 hours to build. The 2nd Platoon of Able Company, 1st Tank Battalion, crossed the river at 14:10 on 20 September and moved up in support of 3-5. The 1st Platoon followed at 1600 and the 3rd Platoon late that afternoon, after the engineers completed a second raft. When the KMCs attempted to cross in DUKWs, the clumsy vehicles bogged down several yards from the river on the south bank. Partridge suggested to the KMC commander that his troops build a makeshift corduroy approach off the main route which Marine engineers were constructing to the embarkation point. The Korean officer agreed with Partridge that this was a sensible solution and soon had his men gathering logs. Neither of them dreamed that they had stirred up an international incident which called for a decision on the division level. American policymakers had felt it necessary to lean backwards to avoid giving communist propagandists any excuse to charge us with recruiting Koreans for slave labor. It was an extremely sensitive subject, and Partridge was astonished at the repercussions. At last, General Craig visited the ferry site and ruled that it was a closed incident after finding all explanations satisfactory. It was further decided, for mechanical rather than political reasons, to take the KMCs across in Amtraks rather than waste any more time on DUKWs. On the night of the 20th, Partridge and Colonel McAllister, the Division G4, interviewed a captured NKPA engineer major at Kimpo Airfield. The prisoner informed them that the bombed highway bridge between Yongdungpo and Seoul had been damaged beyond repair with the means at hand. This agreed with the conclusion of the Marine officers on the basis of aerial observation. Prospects for a span over the Han seemed dim as Partridge was leaving McAllister's quarters. That very evening, however, Lieutenant Colonel Rowney, chief of the 10 Corps Engineers, telephoned to announce that materials for a floating bridge unit had been accumulated by the Army in Japan and would be flown to Korea shortly. Up to this time, with the rafts the only solution, the Marine Engineers had supplied all the materials. But Rowney announced that Corps would assume the responsibility after the arrival of enough materials for a floating bridge unit. Military operations could not wait a week or 10 days for the new span, and the Marine ferry plus Amtraks and DUKWs had to nourish the assault on Seoul. With this end in view, the 1st Shore Party Battalion reverted to division control on the 19th and displaced from Inchon to Oyosori. By nightfall, the entire battalion was bivouacked in this area. On the 20th, after establishing a forward CP at Kimpo Airfield, the Shore Party troops of Baker Company moved up to the Han in support of the 5th Marines, followed by 2 teams from Able Company. Evacuation stations and supply dumps were set up on both banks. Other Shore Party missions were maintaining LVT and DUKW traffic control, providing guides for the Amtraks, posting security at the crossing sites on both banks, and effecting unit distribution of supplies upon request by the DUKWs and LVTs. Control of the ferry site, known as Baker Ferry, became the responsibility of Baker Company of the 1st Shore Party Battalion. Teams 1 and 2 were employed on the south bank, and Team 3 plus headquarters troops on the other shore. Traffic control was of the utmost importance, since ferry operation had to be limited to periods of low tide and during idle intervals a long line of vehicles accumulated. Most of them were trucks containing cargo to be reloaded in LVTs and taken across the river. The Shore Party men had the duty of keeping the traffic flowing as smoothly as possible, both on land and water, and special regulations were enforced to prevent the LVTs from colliding with the ferries. With the establishment of a 3rd ferry, the problem of supplying the troops across the river was pretty well solved. Command ashore assumed by 10 Corps. A military ceremony was held on 21 September when the commanding general of 10 Corps established his CP in Inchon and assumed command at 1700 of all forces ashore. It was stated in some reports that command had been transferred from the commander of JTF-7 to the commander of 10 Corps. But officers familiar with amphibious doctrine pointed out that at no time prior to landing did CG-10 Corps relinquish command, and only through him did the commander of JTF-7 exercise command. The date was also significant for the 1st Marine Division in that its 3rd Rifle Regiment, the 7th Marines, landed at Inchon with Major Francis F. Perry's 3rd Battalion of the 11th Marines attached. Before the ships reached the inner harbor, Colonel Litzenberg went ashore and reported at the division CP. Informing General Smith that troop units in the convoy had been vertically loaded for maximum flexibility, he asked what troops the division commander desired to have unloaded first. "An infantry battalion," said General Smith. "And what next?" "Another infantry battalion," said the commanding general. Colonel Litzenberg began unloading at once, and at 2200 his CP had opened at Wongjongni, 2 miles south of Kimpo Airfield, while H&S Company and 3rd Battalion, Major Maurice E. Roach, occupied nearby assembly areas. The 2nd Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Thornton M. Hinkle, had reached an assembly area at Hill 131, a mile north of Kimpo, by 0100 on 22 September with the mission of providing security for the airfield and a river crossing site. The 1st Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Raymond G. Davis, was given the duty of unloading the ships of the convoy. It appeared for a few hours on 21 September that the enemy might be planning to retake Kimpo Airfield. At 0730, a report came to the 3rd Battalion, KMC Regiment, warning of an attempted NKPA crossing of the Han in the area about 7 miles northwest of the airfield. Airstrikes were called immediately with the result of dispersing the enemy. At 1310, however, an estimated 2 NKPA battalions were reported in front of KMC positions by the air liaison officer attached to the battalion. All units in the Kimpo area were alerted to the possibility of attack. The CO of the 1st Shore Party Battalion was designated as coordinator of defensive forces consisting of his unit and elements of the 1st Engineer Battalion, 1st Tank Battalion, 1st Ordnance Battalion, and 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion. Army troops of the 56th Amphibian Tractor Battalion were also ordered to Kimpo. With an NKPA attack threatening, some concern was felt about an enemy Yak-type aircraft, fueled, armed, and ready for flight, which had been discovered in a revetment on the edge of the airfield by 1st Lieutenant Edward E. Collins of the Ordnance Battalion and later of the 5th Marines. The plane was hastily disarmed and painted with U.S. markings so that it could be flown to Japan in case the enemy overran Kimpo. Although the NKPA threat did not materialize, there could be no doubt of an enemy buildup within striking distance. And it was on this sensitive left flank that the support of naval gunfire was most effective. As early as 19 September, the 1st and 5th Marines had advanced beyond the range of the light cruisers and destroyers. The battleship Missouri was made available the next day, but targets in Seoul proved to be too distant for her maximum range, and no further efforts were made to call upon the battleship's 16-inch rifles. In the Kimpo area, however, naval gunfire was at its best, and a total of 535 8-inch shells were fired from 21 to 24 September by the Toledo and Rochester. These fires were requested by Lieutenant Wieruski in support of patrol actions by the 3rd KMC Battalion. One of the KMC attacks wiped out a company-sized pocket of Red Korean resistance in the vicinity of Cheongdong, about 3 miles northwest of the airfield on the south bank of the Han, with a loss to the enemy of 40 counted dead and some 150 prisoners. After the Han crossing, the 1st Marine Division found itself in the position of advancing astride an unbridged tidal river with the northern flank wide open. Generals Smith and Craig depended on VMO-6 helicopters for their visits to the 5th Marines front. Those rotary-winged aircraft were in increasing demand for evacuating serious casualties, and the commanding general directed that such missions be given priority over command and liaison flights. This meant that Smith and Craig were occasionally bumped. In such instances, they crossed the river by LVT or waited until their helicopter could return. At the time of the Han crossing, the general plan for the 1st Marine Division had been for RCT-5 to clear the north bank and open up crossing sites for RCT-1 in the Yongdungpo area. That regiment would then cross to seize South Mountain, just north of the crossing site, thus forming an enclave in Seoul proper. Further objectives were to be seized by RCT-1 to the north and east while the KMC regiment passed through RCT-5 to attack the center of the city. Here a political motive entered the picture, since it was desired to have Koreans take a prominent part in the liberation of the former ROC capital. To the north, on the left flank of the division, it was planned for RCT-7 to seize objectives to protect the flank and cut off the escape of the enemy. Meanwhile, RCT-5 would revert to Division Reserve as soon as the tactical situation made it possible. So much for the plan. Before it could be put into execution, stiffening NKPA resistance made it necessary to consider revisions. Not only was the hilly terrain northwest of Seoul well suited to defensive operations, but it had been a training area as far back as the Japanese overlordship, the fields of fire accurately charted. Moreover, it had become evident by the 21st that the enemy was about to exchange a strategy of delaying operations for one of defending to the last ditch. The 1st Marines had already experienced the new NKPA spirit at Yongdungpo, and on the 21st, the 5th Marines contented itself with limited advances for the purpose of seizing high ground from which to launch the assault on Seoul. The attack on the 21st was launched astride the railroad by the 3rd Battalion to the north and the 1st Battalion between the railroad and the river. After passing through the 2nd Battalion, Taplett's men seized 3 hills and by dusk were digging in on Hill 216, about 6 miles east of Hill 125 and the ferry landing site. The 1st Battalion had meanwhile advanced to Hill 96, about 3,000 yards southeast of yesterday's objective Dog, now occupied by the 2nd Battalion in reserve. Further gains of some 2,500 yards to the southeast took the battalion to Hill 68, between the railroad and the river, which was seized and held for the night. Enemy resistance ranged from light to moderate in both battalion zones. Between them, the 1st Battalion of the KMCs moved up to Hill 104, just north of the railroad and south of Sechon Creek. This was the situation across the river at nightfall on the 21st. The 5th Marines was in position to grapple with the enemy for possession of Seoul. Hill 104, in the center of the 5th Marines' front, was only 5,000 yards west of the government palace in the northwest section of the city. Less than 3 miles, yet officers and men alike realized that they would have to fight for every inch of the way. If anyone had any doubts, he had only to watch the flashes of gunfire stabbing the night sky to the southeast, and he had only to listen to the unremitting roar of gunfire. For at Yongdungpo, the 1st Marines had been slugging it out with the enemy for the last 3 days in a battle for the rambling industrial suburb. End of Chapter 10, Part 2. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 11, Part 1 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fight for Yongdungpo. If Yongdungpo is lost, Seoul also will fall. This was the warning note sounded during the conferences of the Red Korean military leaders in Seoul. So important did they consider the industrial suburb that a regiment of the 18th NKPA Division was assigned to the defense of the built-up area on the south bank of the Han. Slogans of this sort were a favorite form of communist inspirational literature, and they may have served to buck up the defenders. From the tactical standpoint, however, the quoted catchphrase was illogical. Yongdungpo was untenable. Squatting on the low ground at the confluence of the Kalchan and Han rivers, the town was an isolated landmark of only symbolic significance. It was separated from Seoul by 2 miles of sand and water, and the only connecting links, the old railroad and highway bridges, had long since been destroyed. Thus, what had once been a vital communications hub south of the Han was now a veritable dead end. While the Reds in Seoul were able to ferry troops and material across the exposed river and sand spit by night, they could not hope by this primitive method to meet the logistical requirements of a regimental garrison confronted by a modern juggernaut of combined arms. Nevertheless, the North Koreans chose to make a fight of it, and in addition to the hundreds of troops in Yongdungpo, they sent over considerable artillery and armor that could have been put to better use in the defensible terrain around Seoul. 3 hills taken by 1-5. Hill 118 was the principal terrain feature between Kimpo Airfield and Yongdungpo, the dominating peak being about 3 miles from the former and 2 from the latter. Giant spurs from the main ridge extended northward toward the Han and eastward to the bed of the Kalchan, beyond which lay Yongdungpo. At the end of one easterly projection were the twin caps, hills 80 and 85. Paralleling the Han River, a modern highway led from Kimpo, passed north of Hill 118, skirted 80 and 85, then bridged the Calchon to enter Yongdungpo from the northwest. It will be recalled that the 1st Battalion 5th Marines occupied high ground generally east of Kimpo Airfield at the close of 18 September. During the night, Lieutenant Colonel Murray ordered the unit to seize Hills 80 and 85 the next day. To gain these gates to Yongdungpo, it would be necessary to take Hill 118, and the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Newton, formulated his plan accordingly. Company B would leave its positions on the old Objective Easy at dawn and envelop Hill 118 from the south. Company C would attack frontally from Objective Fox, assist the enveloping force by taking one of 118's spurs, then continue eastward to seize 80 and 85. Company A was to remain behind at Objective Easy for the purpose of guarding the approaches to the airfield. At dawn on 19 September, Company C atop Objective Fox was greeted by a hail of mortar and small arms fire. Under this shield, part of a 500-man enemy force attacked the Marine position from the east, while the remainder attempted to move along the Yongdungpo-Kimpo Highway, obviously bent on reaching the airfield. Other large NKPA concentrations were spotted at the base of Hill 118. Charlie Company's organic weapons roared into action along with the Battalion 81s. While the Marine fire cut swaths through the exposed enemy ranks, Baker Company lunged forward to envelop Hill 118 according to plan. Air and artillery paved the way so effectively that Captain Fenton's unit gained the commanding peak about 1100 without suffering a casualty. This left the North Korean attackers, who had been contained by Charlie Company, trapped between Objective Fox and Hill 118. After losses of 300 dead and 100 prisoners, the Red Force broke into a few small bands that fled across the highway to the fields and villages bordering the Han. Company C's casualties in stopping the attack and moving forward to its spur on Hill 118 were 2 killed and 6 wounded. As the 2 assault companies reorganized on the newly won ridge, Fenton spotted a large number of Red troops on Hill 80, now about 1,000 yards away. He directed an airstrike from his advanced position, and the Corsairs not only cut down many of the North Koreans but completely routed the survivors. While the planes worked over the enemy positions on the high ground, the Marines of Company B observed a growing throng of NKPA soldiers in the vicinity of the Calchon Bridge leading to Yongdungpo. Some of the Reds were milling around, but others were filing across the undamaged span and disappearing into a knot of warehouses and huts at the far end. Fenton radioed for artillery fire just as communist machine guns and an AT weapon opened up on Baker Company from positions across the bridge. 4 times firing for effect with Battery 4 rounds, the Marine howitzer sent a total of 96 shells crashing into the enemy positions within the space of a few minutes. The explosions neutralized the bridge area, but the span itself was badly damaged in the process. First Lieutenant Peterson led Company C along the highway toward Hills 80 and 85 at 1430. Owing to the press of time, the area between the road and the Han River was not cleared, with the result that small bands of enemy were left free to roam the fields and make their presence felt later. The 3rd Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Harold L. Daw, Jr., peeled off the column and attacked Hill 80 shortly after 1500. Following at an interval of 500 yards, 2nd Lieutenant Robert H. Corbett's 1st Platoon continued along the pavement toward Hill 85. A platoon of A tanks supported the 2-pronged assault along with Charlie Company's mortars and machine guns, and by 1650 the 2 heights were secured. In the wake of the airstrike called down by Fenton, the attacking infantry had encountered practically no opposition. Yongdungpo, bristling with communist armament, rumbled its challenge from the low ground 500 yards east of Hill 85. Taken under heavy fire by artillery, mortars, and small arms, Company C was forced to dig in on the reverse slopes of its high ground, there to await the expected counterattack after nightfall. Enemy minefields encountered. As noted previously, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions, 1st Marines, spent the night of 18 to 19 September astride the Inchon-Seoul Highway, a mile east of Sosa. The 1st Battalion, deployed over a broad front in the hills south of the road, was to be relieved in the morning by the 32nd Infantry, so that Colonel Puller could shift his regiment to the left. Since the relief did not take place as early as expected, Puller ordered his 2nd and 3rd Battalions to attack at 10:30, leaving 1-1 in position to await replacement by the Army unit. On the left of the highway, 3-1 jumped off from Hill 123 with Companies H and I in the assault. The battalion's mission was to clear a rambling ridge complex that extended more than 3 miles before stopping short of Hill 118. Assigned as a final objective was the terminal height, Lookout Hill, facing western Yongdungpo across the wide bottomland of the Calchon. Considering the formidable cross-compartment approach, the assault companies led by the Battalion S3, Major Joseph D. Trompeter, made good progress against enemy resistance described as light but stubborn. At a cost of 2 killed and 15 wounded, the Marines combed the vertical wilderness and seized Lookout Hill late in the evening. The attack was almost too successful, for the battalion was now out on a limb. The closest friendly forces were on Hill 118, several hundred yards to the north, and along the Inchon-Seoul Highway, about a mile to the south, as will be shown. The 2nd Battalion could boast comparable success along the highway in the course of 19 September, but gains were made under far different circumstances. Spearheaded by Charlie Company tanks commanded by Captain Richard M. Taylor, the battalion had advanced only 500 yards in the morning when the lead M26 was enveloped in a violent explosion. With 1 track and 2 road wheels destroyed, the steel monster settled into the crater left by the detonation of a wooden box mine. Simultaneously, the infantrymen of Company F came under heavy small arms fire from Hill 72 to the right front. In an attempt to sight in on the enemy positions, other tanks tried to bypass the minefield in the highway, only to discover that explosives were concealed in both road shoulders as well. Howitzers of the 11th Marines registered on Hill 72, and during the ensuing bombardment, a VMF 214 flight appeared overhead to lend further assistance. Despite his generous use of supporting arms, Lieutenant Colonel Sutter was forced to commit all 3 rifle companies to the fight. Tank gunners tried to detonate mines embedded in the road with machine gun fire, but without success. It remained for First Lieutenant George A. Babe's 2nd Platoon, Charlie Company engineers to remove the obstacles under fire. Darting forward on the bullet-swept highway, the engineers placed snowball charges of C3 on the wooden boxes, then took cover while the mines exploded. After 2-1 had driven the enemy from the area with the assistance of Marine air and artillery, the job of clearing the 250-yard minefield proceeded under less hair-raising conditions. To get the armor back into the fight as soon as possible, Babe ignored the explosives embedded in the highway shoulders. Word was passed back to this effect, but several jeeps and trucks were lost later when drivers failed to heed the warning. While the tanks remained on the sideline, Companies D and F punched about a mile down the highway against continuing resistance, which gradually solidified at Hill 146. Like 72, this ridge was on the right side of the road, in the 32nd Infantry zone of action. Since the Army unit had yet to enter the picture, the Marine flank was becoming more and more exposed, with each forward bound by 2-1. Sutter had no choice but to commit troops beyond his zone. Not only were the Reds entrenched on Hill 146 with machine guns and field pieces, but they had blocked the highway with trees and other encumbrances. Thus, while Fox Company seized a knoll on the left, Dog Company invaded Army territory and battled its way to the top of Hill 146's western spur. VMF 214 plastered the peak itself, and the 11th Marines shelled enemy positions across the whole battalion front. It was 1300 when the minefield to the rear was finally cleared, enabling Charlie Company tanks to move forward in an attempt to overtake Sutter's infantry. Within sight of the fighting around Hill 146, The armor ground to a halt before the roadblock of trees, rice bags, and other debris. A dozer tank rumbled ahead, smashed through the first obstruction, then went up in a cloud of smoke. Under the litter on the road lay a second minefield, 75 yards long. Again, the tank men watched from behind as engineers cleared the highway and 2-1 drove forward out of sight. By 1730, the Marine infantry had completely smashed the main enemy concentration on the highway. When the surviving Reds fled, they exhibited the same determination that had characterized their stand throughout the day. Weapons and equipment were strewn along the road, and the Marines captured a truck loaded with mines as further evidence of the hasty retreat. Sutter ordered 2-1 to hold up at 1900 and dig in astride the highway. The 4,800-yard advance had cost the Marine unit 4 killed and 18 wounded, against 350 casualties and 5 prisoners for the North Koreans. Since all written and personal accounts agree that 19 September amounted to almost one continuous firefight for the 2nd Battalion, the amazing contrast in friendly enemy loss figures must be attributed to the sound employment of Marine supporting arms. As mentioned earlier, 2-1's positions for the night were a mile southeast of the 3rd Battalion on Lookout Hill. Company E entrenched on high ground to the left of the highway, 4,000 yards from Yongdungpo, while D and F manned a long, low hill on the right. Because the latter height ran parallel to the road, the line formed by Dog and Fox was at a right angle to that held by Easy. Sutter's choice of this L-shaped defense would shortly prove to be an extremely wise one. NKPA counterattacks of 20 September. The right flank of the 1st Marines was bare. Not until 1200, 19 September, did the 32nd Infantry begin relieving 1-1 in its old position southeast of Sosa. Liaison between the Marine and Army units at this time was weak. Apparently, many of the Marines were unaware that General Barr's Operation Order No. 2 for the 7th Infantry Division did not call for a jump-off by the 32nd until 0630 on the 20th. At that time, the Army Regiment would attack a series of objectives which included Hill 146 and other high ground above the road. Thus, the schedules north and south of the highway were running one day apart, and it would take the enemy himself to straighten the line when he slammed the gates of Yongdungpo. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion 1st Marines, entrucked below Sosa for its circuitous journey from the right flank of the regiment to the left, where it was to relieve the 1st Battalion 5th Marines, on hills 118, 80, and 85. The 11-mile trip via Sosa and Uijongbu was uneventful, except that the troops had to dismount at the latter village and proceed on foot over the primitive road. With the first increment to arrive at Uijongbu, Captain Robert H. Barrow, commanding Company A of 1-1, set a rugged pace to get his troops on top of Hill 118 before dark. Relieving Company B of 1-5, he expected Charlie Company to pass through and replace its opposite of the 5th Marines on hills 80 and 85. It was dusk, and Companies B and C were still on the move when Hawkins of 1-1 met Newton of 1-5. They briefly discussed the lay of the land, the latter's tactical disposition, and the requirement that 1-5 assemble at Kimpo within a matter of hours to prepare for the river crossing the next day. Time, space, and terrain factors were too great, Hawkins concluded, for his battalion to assume all positions then occupied by the other. To facilitate the rest of the relief, which now would take place in darkness, he ordered Charlie Company to occupy Hill 118 with Able and directed Baker to dig in on a southern extension of the Big Ridge. Having relieved Fenton on Hill 118 before nightfall, Barrow enjoyed the opportunity to reconnoiter 1-5's area and to realize the tactical significance of Hills 80 and 85. When it became apparent that Company C would not arrive before dark, he radioed the Battalion S3 for permission to move his company to the Twin Peaks immediately, explaining that Charlie Company of 1-5 could remain in position no later than 2100. Since Hawkins had already decided against taking over too much unfamiliar ground after daylight, Major Bridges turned down the request. Thus, at 2100, with no relief in sight, the 5th Marines Unit withdrew from the two heights as ordered. Company C of 1-1 reached Hill 118 at 2200 and went into position with Barrow's outfit for the night. Unknown to the enemy, Hills 80 and 85 had become a no man's land. While the battalions of the 1st Marines settled down for the night in a 3-mile arc facing western Yongdungpo, the North Korean commander within the town organized part of his garrison for 2 separate thrusts against the closing vice. In one case, he would win by default. In the other, he would see more of his limited resources go down the drain. Just before dawn of 20 September, the Marines on Hill 118 were alerted by a furious clatter of small arms and automatic weapons far out to the east. Daylight disclosed that the enemy was assaulting Hills 80 and 85. When the North Koreans finally discovered that their objectives were unoccupied, they abruptly ceased firing, surged over both crests, and entrenched in about a company's strength. An attempt was made to extend the counterattack to Hill 118, but companies A and C, backed by a flight of VMF 323, threw the Reds back with ease. During the early morning blackness which found the enemy filling the vacuum on Hills 80 and 85, a stronger North Korean force, estimated at a battalion, marched out of Yongdungpo toward 2-1's position astride the Inchon-Seoul highway. In the van of the Red Column were 5 T-34 tanks preceded, oddly enough, by a truck loaded with ammunition. Other vehicles, laden with less sensitive supplies, were safely interspersed among the infantry in the long file. It will be remembered that Companies D and F, the latter in the fore, occupied high ground positions parallel to and south of the highway. Farther back, Easy Company's line tied in at a right angle and extended to the north of the road. The troops of Fox Company, tense with anticipation in their advanced deployment, heard the first distant sounds of clanking armor and racing engines sometime before 0400. The noise grew steadily louder until, at 0430, the shadows of the ammunition truck and T-34s passed beneath the Marine defenses and continued along the road toward Easy Company's lines. At the latter, Private Oliver O'Neill, Jr., rose from behind his machine gun and shouted a challenge to the truck, which by this time was well out in front of the enemy tanks. O'Neill was cut down by automatic fire in answer, and pandemonium broke out on the highway. Obviously, the North Koreans had stumbled into it again, just as they had done at Ascom City. 2 T-34s stopped short of Easy Company's front and opened up wildly. Companies D and F in turn exploded with machine guns, small arms, grenades, and mortars against the flank of the enemy column, while E fought to deny further passage along the road. Under the hail of fire from above, the Red soldiers milled about in panic and were slaughtered. Some flung themselves into roadside ditches, where the crowding only increased the odds of destruction. Others sought escape by scrambling up the slopes, into the very muzzles of Dog and Fox Company weapons. The T-34s began to lurch back and forth like trapped animals. Owing either to mines laid by Marine engineers or a grenade thrown from above, the ammunition truck exploded in a brilliant spectacle of pyrotechnics. In the midst of the furor, Private First Class Monaghan moved across the hillside from Company F's front with his rocket launcher. Observing his progress against the backdrop of flames from the truck, his comrades either held or shifted their fire to protect him. Monaghan closed on the lead tank and wrecked it with one 3.5-inch projectile. Approaching the second T-34 under intense fire, he paused and took aim with imperturbability. Again his rocket connected with a roar, and the black hulk on the road turned into a blazing furnace. Silhouetted against the hillside, the Marine leveled his weapon at a third armored vehicle just as it was pivoting around to retreat. But at this moment, an enemy machine gun found the mark, and Monaghan, killer of tanks, fell dead. Although the North Korean attack was thus smashed at the outset, fighting along the highway continued until daylight. In addition to the 2 T-34s destroyed, Another was captured intact with its crew. The 11th Marines closed the back door of the highway with a curtain of high explosive, thereby sealing the fate of the Red Battalion. Dawn of 20 September revealed a scene of utter ruin across the Marine front. The highway was littered with burnt NKPA trucks, tanks, and equipment. Heaped on the road, in ditches, and along hillsides were 300 enemy dead. Recapture of Hills 80 and 85. For the most part, fighting around Yongdungpo on 20 September was a contest of the giants. Supporting arms of both sides exchanged heavy blows, and the 1st Marines reported with businesslike frankness that it was leveling the southern part of Yongdungpo, which is infested with enemy. North Korean mortars, tanks, and field pieces pumped hundreds of rounds out of positions in the center of town and the eastern outskirts. Marine planes and howitzers replied by smothering red concentrations and emplacements with literally thousands of missiles of all types. The 4th Battalion, 11th Marines, commanded by Major William McReynolds, fired 28 concentrations in the course of a day, and Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edelman's 2nd Battalion expended 1,656 rounds in 21 missions. It was the precision firing of these two units which had supported 2-1 so effectively during the pre-dawn counterattack. Battery C, 1st 4.5-inch Rocket Battalion, FMF, moved to advanced positions in the morning to increase the pressure on the Yongdungpo garrison. Land counterpart of the LSMRs, which rocked the Inchon waterfront on D-Day, this unit had seen little action to date, owing to the lack of M48 fuses for its missiles. Banking on substitute detonating devices, M51 for 105mm and 155mm howitzer shells, First Lieutenant Eugene A. Bush ordered his gunners to fire a test salvo of 24 rockets. No visible effect being noticeable from his OP, the battery commander then called for a full ripple of 144, enough high explosives to flatten a good portion of the town. Again the big missiles plowed into the target area with a dull thud, and Bush withdrew his battery to the rear. The M48 fuses did not arrive until 28 September, with the result that the potent Marine rocket artillery was sidelined until the closing days of the operation. Colonel Puller's tactics during the bombardment on 20 September were designed to align the 1st Marines for the actual assault of Yongdungpo, planned for the next day. It was necessary to occupy in strength all the final approaches to the town, so that the full weight of the regiment could be brought to bear against the defending garrison. From left to right, therefore, the schedule of operations on the 20th was as follows. 1. 1st Battalion to seize Hills 80 and 85. 2. 3rd Battalion to remain in position on Lookout Hill. And 3. 2nd Battalion to advance to the first of 2 highway bridges which span branches of the Kalchan just outside of Yongdungpo. These limited attacks would also provide time for the 32nd Infantry to catch up on the right. The day's mission for the Army unit was to attack over a 6-mile front and secure, among other objectives, towering Tongduk Mountains south of the MSR and 2 miles from Yongdungpo. Shortly after first light, Lieutenant Colonel Hawkins reached the crest of Hill 118 and established his OP. He was in time to see Able and Charlie companies repulse disconnected Red elements moving on the Marine lines from Hills 80 and 85. While the battalion commander issued his order for the attack, Major William L. Bates, Jr., commander of 1-1's Weapons Company, set up his supporting arms center to cover the impending assault. Hawkins gave Company C the mission of taking Hills 80 and 85. Deciding on a southerly approach, the company commander, Captain Robert P. Ray, ordered his 2nd platoon to lead off by clearing a village sprawled across the route to the lower peak. 2nd Lieutenant John N. Guild moved out at the head of the skirmishers and led them over 500 yards of intervening low ground. Nearing a knoll which topped the clump of thatched huts, the platoon came under heavy small arms fire and was stalled. Ray immediately committed the rest of his company in a two-pronged attack which wrapped around the flanks of Guild's line and smashed through the North Korean resistance. After a hot firefight, the surviving Reds fled to Hill 80, and Company C occupied the village and knoll by early afternoon. The executive officer, First Lieutenant James M. McGee, led a 6-man patrol eastward to clean out a small nest of holdouts, while Ray reorganized the company for the assault on the Twin Caps. Charlie Company's tactics in advancing on the enemy's southern flank were ideal from the standpoint of weapons and able companies, which supported the attack from Hill 118. The two units could actually witness the progress of the assault troops across the 1st Battalion's front, so that mortars and machine guns at the base of fire had only to shift gradually left to support the Marine advance. Late in the afternoon, Ray launched a double envelopment of Hill 80. 2nd Lieutenant Henry A. Comiskey led his 3rd Platoon around to the right, and 2nd Lieutenant William A. Craven's 1st swung through the low ground on the left. A few huts concealing snipers were demolished by 3.5-inch rockets, but otherwise the Marines met little resistance as they moved over the crest of the objective early in the evening. With the first signs of darkness already in the sky, Ray lost no time in preparing for his 3rd double envelopment of the day. The remnants of the North Korean company were entrenched on the crest and forward slopes, facing the Marine attack, of Hill 85, obviously intent on making a determined stand. Anticipating Charlie Company's tactics, the Red leader had bent back both flanks to prevent encroachments on the sides or rear. Thus, though both Marine assault platoons swung out to stab at the enemy flanks, the Communist disposition actually relegated each maneuver to a separate frontal attack. Craven's platoon and Charlie Company machine guns, under 1st Lieutenant Francis B. Carlin, covered the attackers from a base of fire on the northern slopes of Hill 80. Moving aggressively through a hail of bullets, the 2nd Platoon on the left crossed the low ground and drove up the western incline of the objective. Almost to the top, Guild was grievously wounded by a machine gun burst. On the right, Lieutenant Comiskey paved the way in the face of heavy resistance. Nearing the crest of Hill 85, the officer abruptly bounded ahead of his platoon and went over the top. He jumped into a machine gun emplacement and was dispatching the last of 5 occupants when his lead skirmishers caught up with him. He ran forward again to clean out another North Korean position in a single-handed attack. By this time, the Reds on the eastern side of the hill had had enough. Those who still had hides to save pelted down the northern slopes in the direction of the mouth of the Kalchon River, where the stream was spanned by the now damaged bridge. Guild's platoon, inspired by its leader who remained in action despite a mortal wound, gained the summit shortly after Comiskey's unit. Captain Ray, following closely behind, later described his meeting with Guild on the slope as follows. He stayed on his feet and turned toward where I was climbing 20 yards behind him. He dropped at my feet and made every effort to remain conscious long enough to tell me how his squads were attacking and pleading with me to keep them attacking. I called for a corpsman. He tried to refuse, saying that he had a wounded man who needed one more than he did. Lieutenant Guild died shortly afterwards. End of Chapter 11, Part 1. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 11, Part 2 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Fight for Yongdungpo. 1st Marines in position. During the morning phase of Charlie Company's attack, Hawkins and the others on Hill 118 were racked by frustration of a type seldom experienced by Marines in the history of the Corps. It will be recalled that the ground between Kimpo and Yongdungpo Highway and the Han River was not cleared in the course of 1-5's attack on Hills 80 and 85 on 19 September. Since the 5th Marines unit had withdrawn to cross the Han at Hwangju, and since Charlie Company of 1-1 had chosen a southern route in recapturing the Twin Heights, Enemy bands in hiding along the riverbank were unmolested. The potential danger in the area was not realized, however, until too late. From Kimpo came a weasel of the 1st Signal Battalion, the crew calmly stringing wire into the 1st Marine Zone as the vehicle rattled along the highway. Just short of the Kalchon Bridge, the little tractor struck a mine and was ambushed by a party of North Koreans. The power-packed Marine infantry on Hill 118, less than 1,000 yards away, watched helplessly as the communication men were either killed or captured. No sooner had the Reds disappeared into the brush with 2 prisoners than a Marine truck, belonging to Alpha Engineers, cruised down the highway with 4 unsuspecting passengers. Captain Barrow ordered his troops to fire over the vehicle, hoping that the driver would hear the bullets in the air and turn back. But the truck continued on into the ambuscade, where it was stopped by an enemy fusillade. The engineers piled out and plunged into a rice paddy in an attempt to escape. 3 of them made it. The 4th, Private First Class Clayton O. Edwards, was tracked down and captured. Although the Marine was out of ammunition and already wounded, one heroic warrior of the NKPA stepped forward and bayoneted him in the shoulder after he had surrendered. Edwards later escaped from a POW train, fleeing before the UN drive into North Korea. Not long after these incidents, Captain Richard F. Bland led Baker Company of 111 through the area and secured Hill 55 and the nearby villages on the bank of the Han. The North Koreans pulled out and crossed the Kalchon to join the Yongdungpo garrison. With fighting going on to the right and left, 3-1 sat quietly on Lookout Hill during 20 September without suffering a casualty. An occasional break in the orange and black pall over Yongdungpo allowed the Marines a glimpse of the wrecked railroad and highway spans, which once had bridged the Han to Seoul. The rock capital was still a long way off for the 1st Marines, and the 2nd Battalion, now on the regimental right and in its 6th straight day of the assault, was more concerned with the immediate foreground. After smashing the Red attack in the morning of the 20th, Sutter's unit jumped off at 0645 against scattered resistance along the Inchon-Seoul highway. The assault elements reached the bridge spanning the western branch of the Kalchon at 12:30, and the battalion commander immediately ordered engineers to inspect the long concrete structure. It was reported to be in good enough condition to support M26 tanks for the attack on Yongdungpo the next day. While the battalion dug in on the west side of the stream, the Marines eyed the 2,000-yard stretch of highway leading ahead to a second span, bridging the Kalchon's eastern branch at the very edge of the blazing town. A high ridge on the right of the road, technically in the 32nd Infantry Zone of Action, was a beehive of North Korean activity. Anticipating the effect of this commanding position on his attack the following day, Sutter contacted Lieutenant Colonel Charles M. Mount, U.S. Army, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 32nd, for permission to shell the height. The Army officer approved the request at 1300, but more than 7 hours elapsed before the necessary clearance filtered through 7th Division, 10 Corps, and 1st Marine Division to reach the 11th Marines. When the howitzers finally opened up, darkness prevented effective observed fire from being delivered on the enemy strongpoint. Out of sight and earshot of 2-1 during 20 September, Colonel Charles E. Beauchamp's 32nd Regiment, in its first day of actual combat, paid with 7 killed and 36 wounded in taking Tongduk Mountain and part of Coppermine Hill. Using the Incheon-Anyang Road as an MSR, the Army unit lost 3 tanks in a field of over 150 wooden box mines. Beauchamp himself narrowly escaped death or serious injury when his jeep struck one of the explosives, killing the driver and wounding a radio operator. By nightfall, the 32nd was deployed far out on the right of the Marines on the Inchon-Seoul highway, and the 31st Infantry, having landed at Incheon earlier in the day, went into position even farther southward. Assault of Yongdungpo. There was no infantry action during the night of 20 to 21 September. Both sides were steeling themselves for the ordeal each knew would commence at dawn. The Red Commander in Yongdungpo threw up formidable earthworks to block the approach over the Calchon from hills 80 and 85 in the northwest, and he concentrated a strong force between the two tributaries in the southwest. That edge of town facing due west, though most defensible, he left unguarded, with the result that a single Marine rifle company would hasten his demise. Marine artillery thundered all night long, and the glare from flaming Yongdungpo rolled back the darkness in an ever-broadening arc. Shortly after dawn, the Marines of Company B, 1st Battalion, threaded across the wreckage of the Calchon Bridge under the cover of machine gun, mortar, and tank fire from Hill 85. Reaching the eastern bank, the attackers swept over a knoll overlooking the Han on the left, which the North Koreans had left undefended. The assault inched forward toward the town, first through sporadic small arms resistance, then into a deadly crossfire from several automatic weapons. Baker Company was now confronted by two dikes which the Reds had converted into a main line of resistance. One of the barriers paralleled the Han River north of Yongdungpo, the other ran the entire length of the western edge of town. Where they met to form a point facing the Calchon Bridge and the Marine advance, a reinforced company of North Koreans was deployed across each levee in strong, mutually supporting positions. Captain Bland chose wisely in directing his attack against the northern dike alone. By this decision, he not only kept his left flank and rear protected by the Han, but also maintained local superiority in numbers over the Reds immediately confronting him. Grinding slowly forward with heavy casualties, Company B rolled up the length of enemy entrenchments on the levee and pushed eastward 2,000 yards by afternoon. The Marines then formed a line with their backs to the Han and shot it out with the Communists on the second dike at a range of 500 yards. At this point the attack stalled, and the fight settled down to one of attrition. Casualties on both sides mounted rapidly under the ceaseless exchange of machine gun, mortar, and tank fire. Part of Bland's difficulty owed to the random deployment of all opposing forces at this time, as indicated on the charts of the 11th Marines. Noting that Company B's positions were along the Han north of Yongdungpo, the artillerymen expressed reluctance to fire on the enemy-held dike to the rear in answer to Lieutenant Colonel Hawkins' repeated requests from his OP on Hill 85. It was a matter of the howitzers pointing generally north towards Seoul, while Bland's outfit, at the moment, was trying to head south. The misunderstanding was finally cleared up late in the afternoon, and Marine Air joined the artillery in pounding the southern barrier. The Reds held stubbornly under the battering, and at darkness Hawkins sent Charlie and weapons companies across the bridge to form a perimeter with Baker for the night. The narrative will now switch to the action in the 2nd Battalion Zone, leaving the separate attack of Company A to be taken up in detail later. Sutter's unit jumped off at 0630 on the 21st with Companies D and E in the assault. The infantry crossed the first bridge without incident, then fanned out to move on the second. It was no surprise when the North Koreans on the intermediate ridge to the right of the highway suddenly threw heavy fire across the Marine front, but it was disconcerting to Sutter that his calls for artillery fire met with the same delay as the previous day. He therefore shelled the high ground with attached 4.2-inch mortars on his own initiative before ordering Companies E and F to attack the enemy bastion. Meanwhile, Captain Welby Cronk led Company D forward on the left of the highway against a strongly defended dike fronting the Calchon's western branch. Progress was slow and casualties severe, but the Marines closed to within 100 yards of the barrier by noon. Then they dug in and slugged it out, while the 2nd and 3rd platoons of Charlie Company tanks alternated in ripping the Communist trenches with 90mm delayed action shells. Heavy fighting continued on the right side of the road until evening. Companies E and F fought partway up the slopes of the ridge and suffered heavily during the close exchange with the Reds on the crest. Since the enemy was still in control of most of the high ground at dusk, Sutter ordered the assault units to withdraw into 2-1 zone and dig in with Dog Company. VMF 214 covered the hot disengagement, one of the most difficult of all tactics, under a masterful job of forward air controlling by First Lieutenant Norman Vining, Sutter's FAC. After bombing and rocketing from 75 to 100 yards beyond the Marine front, the Corsairs closed to within 30 yards for strafing runs to shield the retracing line of infantry. The seventh straight day in the assault had cost the 2nd Battalion 11 killed and 74 wounded, bringing its total casualties since D-Day to 28 KIA and 226 WIA. Partially because of these crippling statistics, Colonel Puller, at 15:30 on the 21st, had committed 3-1 to the relief of the battle-weary outfit. The reserve battalion swung northeast from Lookout Hill to flank the enemy dike positions facing Company D from the eastern tributary. Crossing the Calchon against light resistance, the attackers ran into trouble at the fortified levees fronting southwestern Yongdungpo. After heavy machine guns of 3-1 bested a battery of communist automatic weapons, Companies G and I, the latter on the right, attacked astride the stream branch. Progress was slow, but at a cost of 11 killed and 18 wounded, the Marines rolled up the heavily defended dike and reached the bridge entering the city. Darkness fell with the 3rd Battalion entrenching to the north of the 2nd, both units along the left side of the Inchon-Seoul highway. To the south of the 1st Marines, the 32nd Infantry met with considerable success during its attack over a mountainous 9-mile front. The 1st Battalion on the right mopped up Coppermine Hill, then seized the high ground around Anyang against light sniper fire. In the left of the Army zone and adjacent to the Marines, 232 took its objective south of Yongdungpo against light to moderate resistance. Thus, at a cost of 2 KIA, 28 WIA, and 1 MIA, the regiment succeeded in cutting the railroad and highway leading from Suwon to Seoul via Anyang and Yongdungpo. Difficulties in Marine Army liaison and coordination throughout 21 September stem from the fact that neither realized the size of the gap between them. The map will show that the 32nd's route of advance was planned to miss Yongdungpo by 2 miles, not even coming close to the NKPA strongpoint which gave the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines so much trouble. Able Company on a limb. With the coming of night on 21 September, there was grave apprehension in the 1st Marines over the fate of one rifle company. In the course of the day, the Reds had staved off major penetrations by 2 Marine battalions in the southwest and the better part of another in the northwest. Incredibly enough, one Marine unit of some 200 men had swept through the space in between and cleared the very heart of Yongdungpo, so that when darkness fell, the isolated force was anchored in the rear of the enemy, a good mile and a half beyond the closest friendly units. Company A of the 1st Battalion had jumped off from below Hill 80 on the morning of the 21st, after Baker Company was slowed by the dike positions east of the Calchon Bridge. In committing the unit to an attack through a mile of open rice paddies, Lieutenant Colonel Hawkins was gambling with high stakes for surprise. Captain Barrow employed the classic approach march formation. Forward on the left was 2nd Lieutenant John J. Sword's 3rd Platoon. On the right front was the 2nd, under 2nd Lieutenant Donald R. Jones. To the left rear was 1st Lieutenant William A. McClellan's 1st Platoon, with the dual mission of Company Reserve and flank guard. In the right rear were the 60mm mortars, a section of heavy machine guns of Weapons Company, and the assault squad. Light machine gun sections were attached to each rifle platoon so that they could be employed to the front or flanks on a moment's notice. Barrow's 6-foot 4-inch frame loomed between the 2 assault platoons. To say that these Marines were tense and expectant as they plodded across the broad, flat expanse would be an understatement. Far off on the left and right, small arms crackled continuously at the bridge entrance to Yongdungpo. Marine planes were swooping down in the distance, the hollow eruptions of their ordnance adding to the incessant rumbling of artillery and mortars. Almost hidden from view by the high grain stalks, Company A swept through the rice paddies against no opposition whatever. Its advance was rapid until the 3rd Platoon was slowed by muck, which marked the beginning of the Calchon's bed. Heads craned eagerly to the front and flanks as progress dropped to a snail's pace for several minutes. The crucial moment seemed certainly at hand when the assault line stepped forward from the concealment of the rice and waded into the stream, completely exposed to the wide bank and parallel dike beyond. Still, not an enemy shot was fired. Dripping mud and water, the green-clad figures in the van surged ashore and over the dike. The rest of the men followed, unbelieving, close behind. Retaining the same tactical formation, ready to engage in any or all directions, Company A marched into Yongdungpo. The first buildings were 100 yards ahead of the levee. Barrow channeled his advance astride the main east-west street. Although buildings and dwellings were many, the layout was not dense, and the Marines were able to keep their ranks open and enjoy good all-around observation. The place seemed empty and dead. By noon, Able Company was several hundred yards within the town, its careful search of buildings and side streets having failed to uncover a flicker of enemy resistance. Barrow could tell from the din far out on either flank that he was well ahead, eastward, of Baker Company and the 2nd Battalion. He radioed for instructions, and Hawkins told him to keep going. Halfway through town, Barrow noted on his map that the Inchon-Seoul highway was now converging on his right, so that it would meet the company's attack route just east of Yongdungpo. Because of the furious clatter along the stretch of highway out of sight on the southwest, 2-1's fight, he ordered the reserve platoon to shift from the left side to the right. No sooner had McClellan completed the move than his men spotted an enemy column advancing down the highway in the direction of 2-1's front. The Reds were chanting a spirited military air when the 3rd Platoon opened up and cut the formation to ribbons. Simultaneously, the 2 lead platoons began firing on individuals and small groups in the streets of eastern Yongdungpo. Astonished at the sight of a large Marine force in the very heart of their bastion, most of the North Koreans took to their heels. But there were other Reds, in the rear with the gear, who obviously did not recognize the attackers. After glancing curiously from distant streets, they went calmly about their business. Sword's 3rd Platoon barreled through town on the left of the street and broke into the open. A dike topped by a road lay across the Marine front, and the platoon leader led his men into a hasty defense on top. From this position they could cover the vast sand spit with its airfield and approaches to Seoul. Looking north, they observed a large body of enemy soldiers withdrawing from Baker Company's zone onto the spit. Light machine guns took the North Koreans under fire immediately, and the section of heavies sent forward by Barrow joined in shortly afterwards. Caught by surprise in the open, the Red outfit suffered heavy casualties before the survivors could fan out and disappear. The rest of Company A moved up on the right of the 3rd Platoon, occupying more of the dike and the junction with the Inchon-Seoul highway. It was at this point that Company A, if it could hold the ground, had an opportunity to deal the Yongdungpo garrison a mortal blow. For the road junction turned out to be the enemy's supply center. Across the intersection lay what appeared at first glance to be a huge coal pile. Actually, it was a camouflaged mountain of ammunition. During a firefight with a small group of North Koreans taking cover behind the explosives, one Marine set off the dump with a grenade. The whole countryside shook with the detonation, and the great cloud of smoke that shot into the air marked Able Company's isolated position for the rest of the 1st Marines on the outskirts of town. While part of the unit dug in on the dike, the remainder inspected and cleared the area around the intersection. A 5-story building on the near corner was jammed with captured U.S. Army medical supplies, field equipment, ammunition, and enemy ordnance. The Marines could not use the heavy caliber ammo, but they did help themselves to blood plasma for their wounded. Throughout the afternoon, the Reds made repeated attempts to regain the vital area by throwing small assault parties against Able Company from the south. Each attack was smashed, and darkness found the Marines firmly entrenched on the dike, hoping only that their limited supply of ammunition would last throughout the night. A weak SCR-300 battery prevented further communications with the battalion CP. Yongdungpo secured. If the Marine Corps Schools ever enlarges its varied curriculum to include the defense of a dike, Captain Barrow's tactical disposition on the night of 21 to 22 September 1950 can be taken as a unique precedent. Able Company's commander chose to defend a 100-yard stretch of the levee just north of the intersection. Here the macadam road ran out 25 feet above ground level, and the incline on either side sloped gently. The Marines staggered their foxholes alongside, some high on the slope, others low. Machine guns and bars were placed along the shoulders at the top, so that automatic fire could be directed in volume in any direction. Since all of their ammunition had been fired during the afternoon counterattacks, the 60mm mortar crews laid aside their tubes and went into the line as infantry. Company A's perimeter for the night thus had the shape of a long sausage, with the 3rd platoon in an arc at the northern end, the 1st defending the west side, and the 2nd in position on the east. From their foxholes on the top and sides of the levee, the Marines commanded the sandspit, the road on the dike, Yongdungpo's eastern exits, and the vital intersection with the Inchon-Seoul highway. Fortunately, they had dug their holes deep. At dusk came the telltale rattling, revving, and clanking from the direction of 2-1's front, and 5 unescorted T-34s loomed on the Inchon-Seoul highway, headed toward the intersection. They turned left just short of the crossroads and proceeded in column along a street that paralleled Company A's dike. The Marines on the levee crouched low in their holes. Cruising majestically like a file of battleships, the tank column cut loose with a hail of machine gun fire and salvos of 85mm shells at a range of 30 yards. Able Company's rocket gunners, whose total experience with the 3.5-inch launcher was limited to the firing of a few practice rounds, popped up from their holes and let fly. One of the tanks exploded in a convulsion of flame and smoke, its turret twisted askew as though some giant hand had torn the steel cap from the body. The other 4 tanks continued to the end of the perimeter, then reversed course past the Marine line a second time, pumping a steady stream of steel into the western slope of the dike. Reaching their starting point at the Inchon-Seoul highway, they turned back and made another round trip, with Marine rocket fire damaging 2 more vehicles and sending them limping off the field. The remaining pair, upon completing the 2nd circuit, again reversed course and made a final pass, the 5th, on the Marine lines. Clearing the perimeter, they rumbled into town and disappeared. Fantastic as it may seem, Company A sustained a single casualty, a concussion case, during the half-hour of sustained heavy caliber pounding at pistol ranges. Tremendous muzzle velocity had embedded the 85mm armor-piercing shells deep in the slope of the dike in the split second before each explosion, and Marine foxholes proved to be sufficient protection against the raking machine gun fire. Between 1900 and 2100, it was relatively quiet. McClellan's platoon, facing town, killed a few Reds attempting to remove stores from the 5-story building. Then the long-expected report reached Barrow by sound-power telephone. Sword's platoon, manning the northern arc of the perimeter, could hear a large enemy force approaching its front. The counterattack hit shortly after 2100. Transmitting a running account of the sharp firefight by phone, Sword assured his company commander that he was having no trouble. After 15 minutes of failure, the Reds withdrew for a breather. They struck in the same place half an hour later and were thrown back again, despite any inspiration derived from a display of multicolored flares and wild cries of "Banzai." By midnight, the 3rd Platoon had withstood 5 such onslaughts, each appearing to be in about company strength. Before the last attack, a captive Red officer escaped from Company A's POW compound east of the dike and ran northward into the blackness, shouting repeatedly, according to Barrow's rock interpreter, "Don't attack anymore. They're too strong for you." Apparently, his advice was heeded, much to the relief of the Marines, whose ammunition supply was becoming dangerously low. At midnight, following the enemy's 5th unsuccessful attempt against Sword's position, the fight for Yongdungpo came to an end for the 1st Marines. There was scattered firing throughout the night, but the North Koreans, denied access to their vital supplies, quickly withered on the vine. At dawn, Company A counted 275 dead and 50 automatic weapons around its perimeter, principally in front of the 3rd Platoon. The 4 T-34 tanks which had withdrawn into town were found abandoned. The 1st and 3rd Battalions attacked at 0800 against negligible resistance and converged on the isolated unit, making the historic link-up in short order. The enemy was gone, except for the hundreds of dead that littered the borders of the city. He had left behind practically all of his heavy armament, equipment, and supplies. Continuing the advance on the 22nd, the 1st Marines surged eastward beyond Yongdungpo, then spent the remainder of the day reorganizing and patrolling. On the 23rd, the regiment moved almost unopposed to the bank of the Han, 3-1 seizing Hill 108, which dominated the battered bridges. Later that night, Puller received orders to effect the river crossing early next morning. End of Chapter 11, Part 2. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 12, Part 1 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Main line of resistance. During the night of 21 to 22 September, an NKPA shell crashed through the roof of the native house serving as CP of the 5th Marines northwest of Seoul. The explosion wounded Lieutenant Colonel Hayes so severely that the regimental executive officer required immediate evacuation. Lieutenant Colonel Murray, who escaped with a slight cut, directed that the CP be moved to a cave on the reverse slope of a hill. Thus did the enemy serve notice that henceforward the battle for the northwest approaches to Seoul would be furiously contested. Yongdungpo had been taken by the 1st Marines only after a grim 3-day struggle in which the Korean Reds made their first real stand as distinguished from delaying operations. And now it was the turn of the 5th Marines to meet opposition such as that regiment had not encountered since D-Day. 2 new NKPA units had much to do with the sudden stiffening of resistance. One was the 78th Independent Regiment, commanded by Colonel Pak Han Lynn. This unit, numbering about 2,000 recruits in July, was organized into 3 battalions of infantry supported by medical, motorcycle, weapons, reconnaissance, mortar, and 76mm gun companies, and an engineer platoon. Another recent arrival which won the respect of the Marines for rugged fighting qualities was the 25th Brigade of 4,000 to 5,000 troops. Commanded by Major General Wak Ki-chan, who had reportedly studied in Russia in 1947, the unit was made up of 4 heavy weapons battalions and an infantry battalion in addition to engineer, 120mm mortar, heavy artillery, and brigade artillery battalions. It was literally a fight to the death for these 2 NKPA outfits, which were all but wiped out of existence by the Marines of RCT-5 during the Battle for Seoul. But while they lasted, the 78th Regiment and the 25th Brigade put up a determined and at times desperate resistance in hill country well adapted to defense. 3 hills designated 105. The grapple for the northwest approaches to Seoul began in deadly earnest at 0700 on the morning of 22 September. From north to south, the three assault battalions of the reinforced 5th Marines were the 3rd on the left, the 1st KMC in the center, and the 1st on the right. They were jumping off from the high ground about 3 miles southeast of Hwangju along a line bounded by Hill 216 on the north, 104 in the center, and 68 on the south. Misunderstandings in regard to routes and unit boundaries were made inevitable by maps disagreeing as to place names and heights of ridges. Added to the confusion was the fact that each battalion zone had a Hill 105 as one of its final objectives. Staff officers played safe by designating them 105N, 105C, and 105S to indicate north, central, and south. Ahead of the Marines lay a hill complex which constituted a great natural bastion of interlocking heights and fields of fire. Spurs and defiles leading from one ridge to another enabled NKPA troops to move up in concealment and launch counterattacks in the most unexpected quarters. Casualties in the next 3 days were the heaviest for a comparable period that RCT-5 had suffered in Korea. Added to previous totals, it meant that 17 of the original 18 platoon leaders were killed or wounded in a 50-day period, and 5 of the 6 company commanders who landed with the brigade. Grim as the outlook was, the Marines of the 2nd Battalion enjoyed a sideshow on the eve of battle when Sergeant James I. Higgins and a companion made a prize of an enemy locomotive. Knowing nothing about operating it, they found a simple but effective solution by firing up and opening throttles or depressing levers until the gauges were at the halfway mark. This policy of moderation led to success. The locomotive took off with ponderous docility, and Higgins managed to bring it to a safe stop near the regimental CP. His exploit was not applauded, however, by supply officers taking alarm from the dense clouds pouring out of the smokestack. They did not relish the idea of providing enemy artillery with a target marker, visible for miles, in an area full of exposed Marine ammunition. As a result of their anxiety, Higgins was promptly invited to keep rolling until he reached the rear. The 2nd Battalion remained in reserve while the 1st KMC Battalion jumped off in the center from Hill 104. Heavy resistance was met immediately. In fact, NKPA detachments infiltrated all the way to Hill 104 itself, though it had been secured by 3-5 the previous afternoon. They poured small arms fire into KMCs already taking a pounding from mortar and artillery fire, and the battalion was held up until the high ground to the front could be cleared by artillery and airstrikes. On the left, 3-5 also ran into trouble after deceptively easy progress at first. At 0700, all 3 companies jumped off from Hill 216, secured by Item Company the day before. The new objective, as directed by 5th Marines Operation Order 24-50, was Hill 296. This height was reported by Howe Company as taken at 0945. It was not realized at the time that Hill 296 was actually the bastion of the Red Korean Defense Complex northwest of Seoul if its 3 southern spurs were considered. Attached to the main landmass like the roots of an ulcerated molar were Hills 56, 88, and 105N, with 105C, 72, and 105S describing an arc to the southward. Nearly all of these positions would have to be reduced before the road could be opened to Seoul. Only long-range small arms fire from Hill 338 was encountered by Howe Company at the outset, but enemy pressure steadily increased from the southern spurs of 296. An NKPA counterattack in estimated company strength was repulsed with heavy enemy losses, including some 40 prisoners, by Marine riflemen supported by tanks. Communist pressure was soon renewed, however, with Howe Company receiving heavy small arms, automatic, AT, and mortar fire. Patrols from the other 2 companies, ranging to the northeast of Hill 216 in the early afternoon, met determined opposition. A reinforced rifle platoon of Item Company encountered an NKPA force, an estimated company strength, defending the village of Nakpon-ni. During the ensuing fight, the Marines lost 2 men killed and 11 wounded. Action was broken off at dusk when the 3rd Battalion received oral orders to defend against an enemy infiltrating from the south, southeast, and northeast in attempts to regain lost ground. The fight for Hill 296 had only begun. South of the railroad, 1-5 had about 2,000 yards to cover to its objective, Hill 105S. The battalion plan of maneuver called for Baker Company to deliver fire support while Able passed through Charlie and advanced to the base of the hill. Meanwhile, Charlie was to envelop the objective from the right. When the 3 Able platoons moved into position, they were pinned down by enemy automatic fire from the forward slope of 105S. First Lieutenant Joseph A. Chimente of 3 Alpha and his men had a grim reminder of American reverses early in the war when they found a 50 caliber machine gun and ammunition of U.S. manufacture which the enemy had abandoned. Chimente was severely wounded and First Lieutenant Nathaniel F. Mann, Jr. killed before Able Company won a foothold on the lower slopes of 105S. It took until 1500 for Charlie Company, supported by a machine gun section, to complete its wide swing and close in on the right of the enemy's positions. Baker Company passed through Able, meanwhile, and attacked the forward slopes. At 1720, after an intense mortar, air, and artillery preparation, the 1st Battalion needed only 15 minutes in which to secure the objective. The 3 companies had taken losses of 12 killed and 31 wounded during the day. Close air support was provided for RCT-5 by the MAG-33 squadrons which had begun tactical operations at Kimpo on the 20th. Although they were still in process of moving to the airfield from Japanese bases, VMF-212 and VMF-N-542 flew strikes in support of all 3 assault battalions. Of the 2 carrier-based squadrons, VMF-323 almost doubled its usual number of daily missions on 22 September. Just before nightfall, Lieutenant Colonel Murray directed 1-5 to pull back to Hill 68 with 1 company while holding Hill 105S with the other 2. This shift was made necessary by the fact that the KMCs had been compelled to withdraw to Hill 104, their starting point. As a consequence, the center of the line was more than 1,000 yards in the rear of the battalions on the right and left. The company on Hill 68 was to provide covering fires in the morning, therefore, when the KMC battalion would renew its attack in an effort to regain lost ground. RCT-7 north of the Han. On D+8, the 1st Marine Division had its 3rd Rifle Regiment in line for the first time. Operation Order 9-50, issued at 1200 on 23 September, directed the 7th Marines, less 2nd Battalion, to cross the Han into a zone of action in the rear of the 5th Marines. In response to verbal instructions and a fragmentary warning order the day before, the regimental headquarters and 3rd Battalion crossed late on the morning of the 23rd. Colonel Litzenberg set up his CP on the north bank at 1710, and his men had their first contact with the enemy the following morning. A 3rd Battalion patrol ranging to the north of the battalion zone of action encountered an estimated 200 NKPA troops, and Marine air and artillery supported a successful attack. Division orders called for the relief of 2-7 on the 24th in the area northwest of Kimpo by the 2nd Battalion of the 187th Airborne RCT, U.S. Army. The Marine unit was directed to cross the Han that afternoon, followed by the 1st Battalion, which had completed unloading at Inchon. It had been decided by the division command and staff to give the 7th Marines time for shaking down instead of committing the newcomers immediately to the attack on Seoul. The regiment was assigned a series of 5 objectives along a ridgeline extending from the ferry crossing at Hwangju on a gentle arc to a point north of the city. Protecting the north flank and the rear of the 5th Marines was a primary mission, and Colonel Litzenberg was also directed to prevent the escape of the enemy to the northward. Attack continued by RCT-5. On the morning of the 23rd, the 1st KMC Battalion was directed to attack from Hill 104 at 0700 to straighten out the line. The 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 5th Marines were to remain in position and assist the advance by fire. Heavy and immediate resistance was encountered from NKPA troops dug in on Hill 56. Although the KMCs made a valiant effort, they were soon stopped cold. Only slight gains resulted at an excessive cost in casualties from artillery, mortar, and automatic weapons fire. Lieutenant Colonel Royce moved his CP forward at 1300 to the western base of Hill 104. While his 2nd Battalion assembled under cover of that height, he conferred with Lieutenant Colonel Murray after receiving orders to pass through the KMCs and continue the attack on Hill 56. Both officers realized the advantages of swinging around to hit the enemy from the left after approaching along the low ground. But it was already mid-afternoon, and this movement could not be completed before darkness. The only alternative was a line buck in the center if Hill 56 was to be taken that day. And since the line had to be stabilized and the KMCs pulled back in reserve to give the regimental defense some depth, Murray and Royce agreed that the situation called for a frontal assault without delay. At this stage, the Marine officers did not realize that Hill 56 was part of the enemy's main line of resistance. It seemed logical to them that he would make his final stand on the next ridgeline, crowned with Hills 105C and 105N. As for the repulses suffered by the KMCs, it was a logical assumption that their inexperience had been a contributing factor. In view of these circumstances, a brief artillery preparation and the support of a platoon of tanks seemed sufficient when companies D and F attacked and E contributed fires from the eastern slopes of Hill 104. Captain Peters' Fox Company was to lead off on the right, south of the railroad, and seize the portion of the objective below the railroad tunnel. From this high ground, his men could then support 1st Lieutenant H.J. Smith's Dog Company, moving forward under cover of a sunken road to assault Hill 56 north of the tunnel. About 1,000 yards of rice paddies had to be crossed at the outset, and the expected support of the tanks in this low ground failed to materialize. The leading M26 bogged down in a wide ditch which prevented the advance of the other 4. One of them remained in the paddies to give supporting fires while 3 took a new route along the railroad tracks. Fox Company received increasingly heavy casualties meanwhile on the way across the low ground. Peters ordered 2nd Lieutenant S.E. Sang Sing's mortar section forward, but the officer reported afterwards that his radio did not pick up the message. This left the 3 assault platoons without 60mm support as they climbed the lower slopes of Hill 56 and became heavily engaged with NKPA troops just below the railway tunnel. Apparently, the Reds so overrated the weight of Company F's assault that they lost the topographical peak of Hill 56 by default. Whether their timely withdrawal from Dog Company's initial objective was meant to be permanent is not known, for they might have been caught flat-footed while shifting troops against Fox. Nevertheless, Company D emerged from the sunken road in a column of platoons and moved onto the high ground in its zone against negligible opposition. Lieutenant Heck's 1st Platoon, according to plan, then pivoted leftward to spearhead the attack on the final objective, Smith's Ridge, named by the men after their company commander. Halfway into the connecting saddle, the Marines were caught in the open by a heavy burst of fire from a large knoll on the southern tip of the wooded ridge. Heck fell mortally wounded, and his senior NCO, Staff Sergeant T. Albert Krausen, went down with a shattered leg. In the space of a few minutes, more than half of the exposed platoon became casualties. Startled by the intensity of enemy reaction from this unexpected quarter, Smith personally retrieved the battered 1st Platoon, while the 2nd and 3rd were clearing the northeastern slopes of Hill 56. Then, owing to the lateness of the hour, he deployed Company D defensively on that high ground for the night. There was no contact with Fox Company or any other friendly unit. This fact, coupled with the evidence of strong enemy positions on Smith's Ridge, led the company commander to reconsider carefully his plans for the postponed attack. Fox Company had meanwhile been heavily engaged along the eastern slopes of Hill 56 in the vicinity of the railway tunnel. Peters ordered Lieutenant Anderson to lead his 2nd platoon against the strong NKPA positions just beyond the tunnel. Only 27 men were left to fight it out at close quarters with an entrenched enemy estimated by the platoon leader at company strength. The communist force was wiped out in exchanges of small arms fire and grenades at murderous ranges, but the effort took a frightful toll of the 1st platoon in KIA and WIA casualties. Only 7 able-bodied men were left when Peters ordered a withdrawal to the company position south of the tunnel. All of Anderson's wounded and most of his dead were brought back, and he combined his remnants with the survivors of Lieutenant Nolan's 2nd platoon. A gap of about 50 yards separated their position from 1st Lieutenant Albert F. Balbusti's isolated 3rd platoon as Fox Company dug in for the night. No fault could be found with the overall plan of attack, providing as it did for each assault company to seize ground from which it could support the advance of the other. But as darkness approached, it became evident that the 2nd Battalion had bargained for more North Korean real estate than it could handle. The 2 isolated companies had no choice but to cling desperately to their scorched holdings while organizing to meet an expected NKPA counterattack. Although the other 2 battalions of the 5th Marines had defensive missions on 23 September, enemy threats and encroachments kept them occupied. On Hill 296, in the zone of 3-5, Weapons Company took a good deal of satisfaction in firing a captured NKPA howitzer to break up hostile troop concentrations in the vicinity of Nakpon Ni. Howe Company remained in contact with the enemy all day, supported by 50 caliber and 90 mm fires from Marine tanks. It was in the Howe Company zone that Taplin's men first made the acquaintance of Fireproof Phil. This was the name applied to a gigantic NKPA officer, towering head and shoulders over his troops, who exposed himself with contempt for Marine bullets. Not only his burly build but his light complexion gave some of the Marines the conviction that he was Russian. At any rate, Fireproof Phil was both fearless and lucky. Machine gun bullets and mortar rounds seemed to bounce off his frame. Finally, the tanks paid the honor of making him the special target of 90 mm ammunition, and still Fireproof Phil always had the benefit of a minor miracle at the last moment. Combat leadership by enemy officers and NCOs was outstanding in the operations north of Seoul. On Hill 105S, the 1st Battalion came under pressure all day on 23 September. Movement was impossible for the men of Baker and Charlie companies, and supplies of water, food, and ammunition had to wait for darkness. Enemy smokepots created a haze restricting air activities, but it did not prevent a timely strike flown by Lieutenant Colonel Lisheed and 5 planes of VMF-214 to break up a threatened enemy counterattack on Hill 105S. This was one of 6 close support missions completed on the 23rd by that squadron in the zone of RCT-5. Why the enemy did not launch a counterattack that night against the hard-hit assault companies of the 2nd Battalion is one of the mysteries of the war. But the wary Marines on the slope of Hill 56 attributed their respite to effective and unremitting artillery support. All night long, the howitzers of the 11th Marines lit up the night sky like heat lightning in the rear and crashed like thunder in front as they scourged the NKPA positions. Modified plan of Corps attack. Up to this time, the Corps plan of attack had called for the 1st Marines to clear the south bank of the Han and cross in the vicinity of Yongdungpo to join the 5th Marines in an assault on Seoul from the west and southwest. In view of the location of the boundary between the 1st Marines and the 7th Infantry Division, this meant that the Army troops would not participate in the attack on the city. General Almond had already made it plain in conversations with General Smith that it was highly desirable to take Seoul by 25 September, as GHQ wished to announce the liberation just 3 months to the day after the NKPA invasion. The subject came up again during a conference at Corps headquarters on 23 September. Allman proposed that Smith send RCT-1 around to attack Seoul from the southeast, while RCT-5 continued its assault from the northwest. This plan struck the Corps commander as promising to maneuver the enemy out of the city sooner than the attack as formerly conceived. Smith replied that the NKPA forces defending Seoul had proved to be much stronger than had been expected. He said he was convinced that the enemy would put up a fight from street to street regardless of any flanking maneuvers. The Marine general added that the fierce opposition met by RCT-5 had demonstrated that the western approaches to Seoul were too much for one regiment to handle, and he urged that no change be made to the original plan of crossing RCT-1 northwest of Yongdungpo to aid the attack. This plan, Smith asserted, would offer the advantage of keeping the 1st Marine Division together, for when the 1st and 5th Marines had penetrated well into the city, the 7th Marines could be brought around from the northwest to deliver the coup de grace. Differences between commanders are not remarkable, and it is noteworthy that Corps and Division usually managed in the Inchon-Seoul operation to reach an acceptable solution. Such was the case when General Allman reconsidered on the 23rd and agreed to allow the 1st Marines to cross northwest of Yongdungpo as originally planned and take part in a 2-regiment attack on Seoul from the west and southwest. In place of the 1st Marines, the 32nd Regiment of the 7th Infantry Division was to cross the Han and enter Seoul from the southeast. Amphibian tractors for the operation would be furnished by the 1st Marine Division. Revised 1st Marine Division plans called for RCT-1 to take position on the right flank of RCT-5 after the crossing, then pivot to the northeast and continue the attack through the heart of the city. RCT-7, less 1 battalion in Division Reserve, would have the mission of advancing across the northern approaches to protect the left flank and prevent the enemy from escaping, while RCT-5 sliced through the western edge of the built-up area. Thus, the burden of capturing Seoul fell chiefly upon Colonel Puller's regiment. End of Chapter 12, Part 1. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 12, Part 2 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Main line of resistance. Climax of the Marine assault. As the eastern sky turned gray on the Saturday morning of 24 September, the men on the firing line northwest of Seoul knew that the time had come. They knew with the instinct of battle-wise troops that supporting arms had done all they could. Now it was up to the infantry to come to grips with the enemy. Supporting arms could only sue for victory, and it was up to the infantry to collect. The 2 companies of 2-5 were still clinging by their eyelashes to the scarred slopes of Hill 56. All 3 of the Company F platoon leaders, Nolan, Anderson, and Belbusti, were carrying on in spite of wounds. Corporal Walden D. Harris, who had killed 3 Red Koreans in hand-to-hand combat the day before, refused to be evacuated after a second wound. The survivors of Captain Peters' outfit could not say too much in praise of the support given continuously throughout the night by Captain Arnold C. Hofstetter's Baker Battery of the 11th Marines. There were indications that several incipient NKPA counterattacks had been broken up during the night by the bombardment. In the Dog Company zone, the night had been relatively uneventful except for sniping, though the enemy could be heard digging new positions and bringing up ammunition. The regimental scheme of maneuver, as outlined in Operation Order 26-50, called for the 2nd Battalion to continue the attack, with Hill 105N as the final objective. This meant going up against practically the entire Hill 296 defense system, since Smith's Ridge and all of Hill 88 also remained to be seized. An estimated 2,500 enemy troops, well supported by automatic weapons, mortars, and artillery, were defending every foot of defensible ground in front of the 2 thin companies of 2-5. It was intended that 3-5 should assist by attacking down the principal eastern spur of 296 to outflank the enemy and contribute supporting fires. Taplett's men were to be relieved in gradual stages on Hills 216 and 296 by elements of the 1st Battalion. As a preliminary, Newton was to send out a patrol to secure a portion of the riverbank on the right flank of Hill 105S in preparation for the crossing of the Han by the 1st Marines that morning. The reserve company of 1-5 would then commence the relief of the 3rd Battalion while the 1st Battalion of the KMC Regiment remained in an assembly area in the rear of the 5th Marines, and elements of the 7th Marines protected the left flank. Units of 1-5 were to continue to defend 105S, seized and held at a total cost of 27 KIA and 72 WIA, until the crossing of the 1st Marines and the relief of 3-5 had been completed. 2 small enemy counterattacks were repulsed without much trouble by elements of 3-5 on Hill 296 before dawn. Company H remained in contact with the enemy on the eastern slopes until 1550, when Company G moved around the right flank and a coordinated attack was launched against moderate NKPA artillery, mortar, and AT fires. Relief of Item Company and other 3-5 troops remaining on Hill 216 was completed by the 1st Battalion at 2000. Casualties of the 3rd Battalion for the day were 5 killed and 33 wounded. The movements of these 2 battalions were subsidiary to the main attack launched by 2-5 on 24 September. H hour at 0630 was preceded by a 20-minute artillery preparation and an airstrike by VMF 323 planes. Lieutenant Colonel Royce planned to bring up Easy Company from reserve on Hill 104 and push it forward between Dog and Fox, while those companies completed the seizure of Hill 56 and cleared the heavily wooded spur to the north known as Smith's Ridge, linking up with the main landmass of Hill 296. Easy Company would then take the lead in a battalion attack aimed at Hills 88 and 105N as the final objectives. Fox Company jumped off on the eastern slope of Hill 56. Nolan having been evacuated, Anderson led what was left of the 2nd and 3rd platoons, a total of some 20 riflemen. Belbusti commanded about the same number in the combined assault on the heavily defended finger of high ground east of the tunnel. Counting machine gunners, mortarmen, and troops bringing up ammunition, Fox Company had been reduced to fewer than 90 effectives, including wounded men refusing evacuation. Corsairs of VMF 323 swooped down to drop 500-pound bombs less than 100 yards in front of the attackers. Thanks to such close air support, Fox Company soon seized high ground, which enabled the men to gain fire superiority. At this point, they took cover to make use of their advantage in an exchange of small arms and automatic fire. Dog Company, with 2 platoons still almost at full strength, had at least a dozen walking wounded who elected to keep on fighting. Ground mist and smoke from burning huts made for low visibility when the men jumped off in a column of platoons. The enemy opened up from Smith's Ridge as the Marines came within close range, pinning them down for 2 hours by concentrated and accurate artillery, mortar, AT, and automatic fire. One of the Marine tanks moving up the road in support was disabled by a mine, and another became inoperative after a direct hit by an NKPA mortar shell on the motor hatch. The Epic of Dog Company. The large knob across the sunken road from Hill 56 remained to be taken before Dog Company completed its mission by advancing northward to clear the enemy from the wooded spine of Smith's Ridge. After the attack stalled with heavy casualties, Lieutenant H.J. Smith ordered every available man into the line, including personnel of company headquarters. 2 Marine machine guns were kept in action at a cost of repeated casualties as First Lieutenant Carl Seidel made 5 consecutive trips under fire to bring up ammunition. At some points, the opposing forces were within long grenade throwing distance. In these exchanges, the Marines had a pronounced advantage because of stronger arms and the control developed by baseball. Both sides attempted without success to break the deadlock by sending out detachments for flanking movements. Sergeant Robert Smith of McNaughton's platoon led a squad in a wide-end sweep to the north, only to meet such fierce NKPA opposition that Smith and 8 of his men were killed, including a corpsman. Only 3 wounded Marines ever got back. At 10:00, the company commander sent the first of 3 messages to inform the battalion CP of his situation and request reinforcements. Royce could only reply that Easy Company, his reserve unit, was irrevocably committed to the attack on the final objectives. During the course of the battle, the battalion commander himself was wounded by a mortar fragment but returned to the CP after having his arm dressed. When 2nd Lieutenant George Grimes' 60mm mortar section ran out of ammunition, the survivors fought as riflemen. 2 platoon leaders, McNaughton and Lieutenant Howard, were wounded but continued in action. About 10:30, as the smoke and mist cleared, the howitzers of the 11th Marines and the 81mm mortars of 2-5 poured it into the enemy positions along the wooded ridge. The men on the firing line had another welcome assist when 4 Corsairs of VMF 323 roared in to make passes with bombs, rockets, and napalm. Lieutenant Smith had 44 effectives left as he alerted his men for the assault. McNaughton, Seidel, Grimes, and 1st Lieutenant Carl Worth were the other officers still on their feet. Platoons, sections, and squads had ceased to exist as units when the 44 men of Dog Company moved out of their foxholes and swarmed over the high ground that had held them up for more than 2 hours. First impressions under more normal circumstances would have been shocking, for the position held more enemy dead and dying than the Marines had ever seen before in Korea. The entire area was honeycombed with foxholes, trenches, and bunkers, which had become the graves of Red Koreans cut down by Marine air and artillery. There they had died at their posts, crowded together so closely that every shell, bomb, or rocket had caused frightful carnage. The dead outnumbered the living, in fact, for the men of Dog Company met unexpectedly weak resistance from the few NKPA effectives who trusted to their weapons instead of to their feet. Lieutenant Smith paused to regroup in a skirmish line for the final attack to clear the remainder of the ridge. Again, the Marines seemed to prevail by sheer moral ascendancy as the assault went forward by leaps and bounds. But the victory was bought at the cost of the company commander's life, for Smith was killed at the head of his men. Only 5 additional casualties were taken in this phase, but Marines dropped from exhaustion until McNaughton, as acting commander, had just 26 able-bodied men left at the finish. They were greeted by the strange spectacle of 3 enemy officers exhorting about 150 Red Koreans to retreat. No second invitation was needed, and the Marines had a turkey shoot at the expense of foemen scurrying down the eastern and northern slopes in the direction of Seoul. Seidel was the only officer left unwounded when Dog Company notified the battalion CP at 1300 that objectives had been secured. Fox Company reported about 2 hours later that it had also seized all assigned ground and was digging in after a mopping-up period. Casualties had not been heavy on the east side of the ridge as compared to the day before. The Company F attack consisted of 2 prolonged firefights in which the Marines seized better positions and made good use of their advantage. After reaching the objective, they took cover and proceeded systematically to cut the enemy down to size with the support of VMF 214 planes. Captain Peters then sent both platoons forward to eliminate an NKPA force firing on them from a distance. Anderson's men passed through a small built-up area and took cover behind a stone wall on the enemy's flank. Opening fire on communists about 300 yards away in an open field, they made short work of the opposition. 2nd Lieutenant Wiley J. Grigsby, the machine gun platoon leader, was killed in the day's final Fox Company attack. Anderson's composite platoon had 3 men killed and 3 wounded. Among the casualties was Corporal Harris, who received a mortal wound after twice refusing evacuation. He was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross. The attack of Easy Company on Hill 105N was delayed until after the 2 companies took their objectives. At 1500, after moving up from battalion reserve, Jaskilka's men ran into heavy enemy mortar and automatic fire soon after passing Hill 56. 2 tanks of the 1st Platoon, Company B, 1st Tank Battalion, were knocked out, one by an AT mine and the other by a direct hit of a mortar shell. The remaining 3 tanks could not have continued in action except for the efforts of Staff Sergeant Stanley B. McPherson of Company A, 1st Engineer Battalion, who went ahead and cleared a path through the enemy minefield. By some miracle, he survived the hail of NKPA fire unhurt, and the tanks went on to destroy 2 enemy AT guns and several machine gun emplacements. The main enemy stronghold appeared to be Hill 72, a conical height located between Hills 105N and 105C, and enfilading both of them. Not enough daylight remained on 24 September to mount an assault on this position, and the effort was put off until the following morning. Marine Air had a busy day. Lieutenant Colonel Lisheed's VMF 214, repeating the pattern of the day before, launched strikes of 5 aircraft every 2 hours in support of 25's attacks northwest of Seoul, a total of 6 missions. Not only was the city a flak trap, but the Marine pilots were flying Corsairs from which the armor around the air cooler system had been removed by order of Buair as a peacetime economy measure and never restored. As a consequence, NKPA small arms fire was likely to hit the oil lines and send a machine down in flames. A first small record for combat sorties flown in a day by a single squadron was set on the 24th by VMF 212, with 12 flights and 46 sorties. Close support missions were about equally represented along with search and attack. Nightfall of this eventful day found 2-5 in possession of ground containing the most enemy dead in a small area ever seen in the Inchon-Seoul operation. Lieutenant Colonel Royce estimated that 1,500 NKPA bodies were left on Hill 56 and Smith's Ridge, and the command of the 1st Marine Division put the figure at 1,750 enemy killed in the Hill 296 defenses. Survivors of Dog Company agreed that in spite of such frightful losses, the Red Koreans had enough able-bodied men left at the finish to make mincemeat of the 26 attackers who took Smith's Ridge. But this Marine effort seemed to break the heart of the enemy resistance in the Hill 296 defense complex, thus giving fresh proof to Napoleon's famous dictum, "The morale is to the material in war as 3-1. River crossing of RCT-1. The battle for Seoul entered its final stage on the 24th with the river crossing of the 1st Marines. At first light, a site about 2,000 yards southwest of Hill 105S was cleared by Charlie Company of the 1st Engineer Battalion. Extensive mine clearing operations at the crossing site area caused delays, and it was 0800 when reconnaissance and assault elements of 2-1 embarked in the LVTs of Company A, 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion. Sutter's troops completed their crossing at 0945 against scattered and ineffectual fire, and made contact that afternoon on the north bank with elements of Company C, 5th Marines. For lack of a ferry, the 1st Marines had no tank support at the crossing site. Plans had been made to send Baker Company, 1st Tank Battalion, around by the Hwangju Ferry to join the infantry north of the river. As it worked out, however, the armor was delayed by a fight on the north bank which will be discussed in the next chapter. Hill 79, about 4,000 yards from the crossing site, had been assigned to the 1st Marines by Division Operation Order 10-50 as an objective. The 2nd Battalion began a rapid advance toward this point after moving into position on the north bank abreast of the 5th Marines on a 1,500-yard front. The 1st Battalion and regimental headquarters were next to cross. Puller ordered Hawkins and his men to drive eastward along the river and pass through the 2nd Battalion. Since that unit was rapidly advancing at the time, one of the 1-1 staff officers looked dubious. "You'll just have to advance a little faster," explained the veteran regimental commander. This proved to be a practical, even if not exactly a school solution. On the march, the 1st Battalion had the same experience as the 2nd when small arms and automatic fire came from Hill 105S, supposedly secured by 1-5. Again, the enemy was demonstrating his ability to hide out behind the Marine lines and make the most of his nuisance value. The 2nd Battalion had 2 men killed and 9 wounded by harassing fires, and the 1st suffered 4 casualties while passing through at 1300 to continue the attack. Effective Marine artillery and 4.2-inch mortar fire supported the advance. After drawing out of range of Hill 105S, Hawkins and his men encountered long-range small arms fire, and roads into the city were mined. Hill 79 was located in the southwest section of Seoul itself, commanding a good view of the railroad marshalling yards and industrial area. After seizing the objective at 1500, the men celebrated by raising an American flag, thus precipitating a friendly race with the 5th Marines and exuberant ceremonies of this sort. At 1515, the 3rd Battalion was relieved by the division of its mission of defending Hill 108, south of the wrecked Han bridges, and reverted to regimental control for a river crossing completed at 2000. On the north bank, Ridge's outfit was thought to have pulled the last fangs of enemy resistance on Hill 105S after his men in their turn came under fire from hidden opponents. Since this height dominated the new regimental CP, Company I was given the mission of outposting the height. A small but lively firefight took place at dusk, and the Marines bagged 10 prisoners at a cost of 1 man killed and 2 wounded. The 3rd Battalion went into an assembly area near the crossing site for the night. Hawkins set up a perimeter defense on the objective, and the 2nd Battalion occupied positions about 2,000 yards in the rear. A few probing attacks were received from enemy patrols on Hill 79, but Marine artillery and 4.2-inch mortars made short work of these attempts. End of Chapter 12, Part 2. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 13, Part 1 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953, Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Seoul as a battlefield. On the morning of 25 September 1950, with RCT-1 across the river, the 1st Marine Division was in a position for the first time since D-Day to launch an attack of all 3 regiments abreast. This was but one of the portents indicating that the days of the North Korean People's Army were numbered. Exactly 3 months had passed since the invasion of the Republic of Korea, and now the forces of the Communist puppet state were reeling under blows from 2 directions. While 10 Corps pounded inland to seize the NKPA main communications hub, the 8th Army had smashed through the Pusan Perimeter and was driving northward to place the enemy between 2 fires. The big break in South Korea came on 23 September. Up to that time, the NKPA 5th, 8th, 12th, and 15th Divisions had put up a stubborn resistance on the northern front of the Pusan Perimeter against 6 ROK divisions. Then the enemy crumpled, and the ROKs began an advance that would take them 70 miles during the ensuing week. It was much the same story along the Kumcheon-Taejeon axis of the Central Front. There the U.S. 1 Corps, comprising the U.S. 24th Infantry and 1st Cavalry Divisions, the 1st ROK Division, and the British 27th Brigade, drove a deep salient into the line of the 1st, 3rd, 13th, 10th, and 2nd NKPA Divisions. UN gains of 35 miles were made from the 22nd to the 25th. In the south, the U.S. 2nd and 25th Divisions had hurled the NKPA 6th, 4th, 9th, and 7th Divisions back from the vicinity of Masan to the Chinju area. The gain of about 15 miles from 21 to 23 September was only a prelude as the 2 U.S. divisions pressed their advantage against a retreating enemy. The ultimate purpose of the joint 8th Army and 10 Corps offensive must already have been made alarmingly apparent to NKPA generals. Not only was the 8th Army salient along the Kumcheon-Taejeon axis being extended northwest, but a 10 Corps regiment was driving southeast toward a junction. This was the 31st Infantry of the 7th Infantry Division, which had been given the mission of following in the trace of the 32nd, then wheeling southward toward the Suwon area to meet the elements of the 1st Cavalry Division spearheading the 8th Army advance. Thus was the drawstring being rapidly pulled on the remnants of the invading NKPA army, soon to have its main routes of escape cut off by UN forces. 2 more river crossings. After nearly a week of commanding a division in combat on both sides of an unbridged tidal river, General Smith and Craig now had a consolidated front north of the Han, with RCT-1 on the right, RCT-5 in the center, and RCT-7 on the left. The 11th Marines was in position on the south bank. The 1st, 3rd, and 4th Battalions lined up northwest of Yongdungpo, while the 2nd Battalion and the U.S. Army 96th Field Artillery in place to the east of that shattered suburb. 2 more river crossings took place on 25 September. First, the 32nd Infantry of the 7th Infantry Division moved to the north bank in accordance with the revised Corps plan. The Marine 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion, less Company B, and the Army's Company A, 56th Amphibian Tractor Battalion, had to make a 25-mile round trip that night to bring the troops to an embarkation point about 5,000 yards east of the railroad bridge at Yongdungpo. Scattered enemy small arms and artillery fire was received during the crossing, resulting in a few casualties among crews and soldiers. The LVTs took the troops about 200 yards inland, where they advanced on foot to their objectives on South Mountain without encountering any opposition other than long-range harassing fires. Later that same day, the 17th Rock Regiment, under the control of the 7th Infantry Division, crossed in the LVTs. It was hoped by United Nations leaders that this unit, known as the Seoul Regiment, could take part in the liberation of the Rock capital. Apparently, the second river crossing of the day alarmed the enemy, for it drew mortar and artillery fire in greater volume and accuracy than had been encountered before. The support given to the 2 crossings by the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion was commended by General Barr in a letter to General Smith. Despite long hours, loss of sleep, maintenance difficulties, and exposure to fire, said the commanding general of the 7th Infantry Division, the personnel of your battalion performed so magnificently that I have nothing but praise to offer. If at any time in the future elements of this division are called upon to cross a river, it is my sincere wish that they may be supported by the 1st Amphibian Tractor Battalion. From South Mountain, the troops of the 32nd Infantry looked down upon the city. They could not enter as yet because of the danger of interfering with the fires of the 1st and 5th Marines. But the 32nd and the Rock Unit were assigned a zone of action by Corps for an advance on the right of the Marines when the time came for a concerted effort. Division attack of 25 September. At 0700 on the 25th, the 1st Marine Division launched the final phase of its attack on Seoul. The following objectives were assigned by Division Operation Order 11-50. RCT-1, with the 2nd KMC Battalion attached, was to seize the part of Seoul within its zone of action and Objective Able, consisting of the high ground beyond the northeastern outskirts and about 6 miles from the jump-off positions. The zone of action, ranging from 1 mile to 1.5 miles wide, carried the attack through the heart of the city, with South Mountain on the right and Doksu Palace on the left. Mopping up operations were assigned to the KMCs, who would revert to their own regimental control afterwards. RCT-5, with the Division Reconnaissance Company and 1st KMC Battalion attached, was to seize that part of Seoul within its zone of action and Objective Baker, comprising the high ground overlooking the Seoul-Uijongbu Road 6 miles from the line of departure. About 1.5 miles wide, this zone included the northwest section of the city and the government palace, though the regiment would be operating in open country after an advance of about 2 miles. The KMCs were to be used for mopping up after RCT-5. RCT-7 had the mission of protecting the left flank of the division and seizing Objective Charlie, the high ground astride the Seoul-Kaesong Road about 6 miles northwest of the center of Seoul in the vicinity of Cheongsong-ni. The KMC Regiment, less the 1st and 2nd Battalions, was designated the Division Reserve. It was to be prepared to resume control of detached battalions and occupy Seoul. The 3rd Battalion, 187th Airborne RCT, with Special Operations Company attached, was to continue under operational control of the 1st Marine Division and protect the Corps left flank west and south of the Han River. Following the artillery and air preparation, 3-5 and 2-5 jumped off abreast from left to right in an attack on the remaining defenses of the Hill 296 complex. Royce's objective was Hill 105N. He was to be supported by fires from Taplett's men, attacking down the slopes of Hill 296 in an advance that would eventually pinch out the 2nd Battalion, which would go into reserve. The 1st Battalion had completed its relief of 3rd Battalion elements on Hills 216 and 296, thus placing it in position to move up on the left of the 3rd. During the airstrikes, VMF 214 had its 2nd pilot fatality in 2 days when Lieutenant Colonel Lishid was shot down in flames over the western edge of the city. His death brought to light a curious train of circumstances. It was recalled that the squadron had lost its 1st pilot on D+2 when enemy fire killed Captain Simpson in plane number 17. 2 days later, while inspecting the new number 17 on the flight deck of the Sicily, Technical Sergeant George C. Underwood received a mortal wound from an accidental discharge of the guns. Major Robert Fleck was flying this Corsair when he met his death on 23 September, but the machine was saved. And it was in plane number 17 that the squadron commander crashed on the 25th. This was enough for Captain John H. Thack of the Sicily, and he issued an order banning the number forever on the carrier. Within 2 hours of Lishid's death, 2 other squadron commanders were shot down, Lieutenant Colonel Wachowski of VMF 212 and Lieutenant Colonel Volkansek of VMF N 542. Both escaped with moderate injuries, but in the space of a few minutes, Volkansek had pressed his luck within a hair's breadth of the point of no return. Wounded, his plane badly damaged by enemy fire from Seoul, the squadron commander stubbornly led his flight in 2 more passes on red positions. Approaching Kimpo, he was forced to keep the battered F-7F-3N at almost 200 knots, twice the landing speed, to prevent its stalling. There was no alternative but to bail out. When he jettisoned the canopy, his altimeter needle wavered around the 1,000-foot mark. Slipstreams from the 2 engines pinned him to the cockpit as the plane continued losing altitude. In desperation, he kicked violently at the stick with both feet. The aircraft lurched downward, and Volkansek was thrown clear, the big tail of the machine missing him by inches as both plummeted earthward. A few seconds after the officer's chute opened and broke the fall, his feet touched earth a few miles northwest of Kimpo. Within 45 minutes, he was aboard a helicopter rattling back to the airfield. It was the last day for the Sicily and VMF 214 in the Inchon-Seoul operation. That evening, the CVE left the area for maintenance work, and the Badong Strait took over with VMF 323. Easy Company led the attack of 2-5 on the 25th, with Dog on the left and Fox in reserve. The advance was supported by a platoon of tanks as well as fires from 3-5 on Hill 296. An effective artillery preparation aided the advance, but Captain Jaskilka's men were enfiladed by enemy mortar and automatic fire from Hill 72. Lieutenant Deptula's platoon led the assault and seized its position by 13:35 after suffering heavily along the way. Lieutenant Seidel commanded the remnants of Dog Company, which jumped off from Smith's Ridge and took Hill 88 at 13:20. While Fox Company moved up to occupy Hill 72, an airstrike was called on Hill 105N at 13:10, and the artillery bombardment began 15 minutes later in preparation for the final assault by Easy Company. Second Lieutenants James W. Epley and Samuel L. Eddy, Jr. led the advance with their platoons, and Hill 105N was reported as secured at 15:45. The 2nd Battalion, with the exception of Deptula's platoon, had met moderate opposition as compared with the last 2 days. It was in the zone of the 3rd that the enemy put up his most stubborn resistance on 25 September. George and Howe companies, the latter on the exposed left flank, led the attack on the remaining NKPA positions along the 2 southeastern spurs of Hill 296. Initial progress was slow, the attackers being harassed by long-range fires from Hill 338 on the left and 105N on the right. Lieutenant Colonel Murray directed the battalion to hold up until the situation around 105N clarified. Resuming the attack against mounting resistance on the left, at 14:35, the 2 companies reached their objectives 2 hours later and made contact with 25 on the right. Since 105N capped the terminus of the lower of 35's 2 spurs, the whole length of the 1,000-yard projection was tagged with that number. This fact accounts for both Royce and Taplett's reporting that they were in possession of the height. Actually, 25 was on 105N, and George Company of 35 held an unnumbered peak to the north on the same ridge. Company H, in moving down the huge spur on the open left flank, had taken heavy casualties before reaching its objective, an intermediate peak. Just as Item Company was passing through to continue the attack at about 1700, the Marines were hit hard by a force of 200 Reds, who advanced under cover of accurate supporting fire. The close-in firefight raged until after nightfall, and both depleted companies were hard-pressed to hold their own. Weakened by the loss of 100 dead, the enemy finally withdrew, thereby allowing Item Company to take over the front line while Howe reverted to battalion reserve. Thus, the 3rd Battalion was now in position to pinch out the 2nd on the morrow and to trace Item Company's spur into the very heart of Seoul. In preparation for the assault of Hill 338, Newton's 1st Battalion had shifted to the regimental left, where, with the Division Recon Company and the 1st KMC Battalion, it blocked the precipitous approaches to 216 and 296. In the zone of the 7th Marines, the 2nd Battalion had jumped off at 0630 and occupied Objective Charlie at 1215 without meeting resistance. Patrols of the 1st Battalion devoted the day to reconnoitering the area between RCT-7 and RCT-5, maintaining contact with both. The 3rd Battalion was employed defensively along roads and trails in an arc around the ferry crossing site at Hwangju. Tank victory on Hill 105S. In preparation for the attack of the 1st Marines, the 3rd Battalion moved forward before daybreak in a column of companies. Passing eastward through the 2nd Battalion, Ridge's men began a sharp wheel to the north. The 1st Battalion, on Hill 79, withdrew slightly, pivoting on its left flank in order to reorient its direction of attack and tie in with the 3rd Battalion on the left. Thus did RCT-1 carry out the Corps plan of maneuver on the morning of the 25th by making a 90-degree change of direction, after advancing eastward to Hill 79 and driving straight northward toward the heart of Seoul. It was necessary to jump off without tank support, however, since the assigned armor had been delayed by a fight on the way. The 2nd and 3rd platoons of Captain Bruce F. Williams Baker Company, 1st Tank Battalion, had crossed the river at the Hwangju Ferry on the 24th. Reports of enemy mines along the railroad leading into Seoul caused Lieutenant Babe's 2nd Platoon of Company C engineers to be attached to the tanks. And since the column was to pass through the zone of the 2nd Battalion 5th Marines, a depleted infantry platoon of Company F was attached under the command of Staff Sergeant Arthur Farrington. Owing to the shift of 1-5, a gap existed at this time between the zones of the 1st and 5th Marines, and the little task force entered this area with the infantry at the point and the engineers sandwiched between the tanks, a total of some 50 men supporting the armor. About half of the gap between the regiments had been safely traversed when the head of the column received a few scattered shots from the slope of Hill 105S. After being supposedly secured by 1-5, with a final mopping up by 3-1, this troublesome position now erupted into enemy small arms fire that could only have come from at least a company-sized pocket of resistance. Lieutenant Babe was severely wounded before he could carry out his plan of sending Farrington's platoon around to envelop the left flank of the NKPA troops entrenched on the slope. After Technical Sergeant Pasquale Paolino took command of the engineers, his men and the infantry platoon were so badly outnumbered that Captain Williams considered pulling them inside the tanks and withdrawing. Then it occurred to him to send a flamethrower tank, escorted by Staff Sergeant Alter's M26, around the enemy's left flank by way of a primitive trail leading southward from the railway tracks. This maneuver had a spectacular success. The flame tank moved into a position enabling it to sear the length of the NKPA trenches with bursts of napalm. When the terrified Red Koreans fled down the slope, they became targets for the machine guns of Lieutenant Cummings' platoon of tanks. Sergeants Paolino and Farrington had meanwhile been organizing an infantry and engineer base of small arms fire from men taking cover along the railroad embankment and the lower slopes of the hill. The engineer NCO noticed that enemy grenades were being lobbed from 3 thatched huts below the NKPA trenches on the left flank. Closer inspection revealed the mouth of a cave, concealed by the third house and extending back into Hill 105S. Paolino, after getting Williams' permission to direct tank fire, banged on the hull of Cummings' M26 and indicated the huts and mouth of the cave as targets. A few 90mm rounds destroyed the huts, but before Cummings could fire into the cave, 8 or 10 NKPA soldiers came out with upraised hands. When they were allowed to surrender unharmed, the example had an amazing effect as a seemingly endless file of enemy troops poured out of the cave. Altogether, 131 prisoners were taken, in addition to an estimated 150 killed, on a hill first reported secured 2 days before. Apparently, the undiscovered cave had provided a refuge for nearly 300 Red Koreans. Among the captives, as the Marines discovered later, were 2 women in uniform who had evidently been armed. Because of the NKPA reputation for treachery, it was considered necessary to search them, but they were treated with respect and provided with garments more appropriate to their sex. In spite of the consideration shown them, the incident resulted in sensational articles in stateside publications after the women reached the rear and claimed mistreatment on the grounds that they were nurses. 2 wounded engineers and an infantry casualty were the price of the Marine success after a surprise encounter had been turned to the disadvantage of the enemy. Since the NKPA prisoners were more than double the numbers of the engineers and infantry, they were placed between 2 M26s when the column resumed the march. It was 1200 when Cummings reported to Colonel Puller at the intersection of the railroad and a boulevard with streetcar tracks leading into the heart of the city. The tanks took the lead, joining 3-1 in its fighting advance up both sides of the north-south boulevard. Enemy mines knocked out 2 of the M26s, one of them being Cummings' tank, but both were retrieved in spite of heavy NKPA fire. Successive roadblocks consisting of earth-filled rice bags were stubbornly defended by enemy infantry supported by NKPA automatic, AT, and mortar fire from the rooftops. The Marines pressed forward methodically, and by evening the 3rd Battalion had penetrated about 2,000 yards into the city to occupy positions astride the streetcar line and on the western slopes of Hill 97. The 1st Battalion, on the high ground to the right, had advanced about 2,000 yards when both assault units tied in for the night with defensive positions on Hill 82. The 2nd Battalion, as regimental reserve, deployed in the rear of the 1st to protect the right flank and rear. Night attack ordered by Corps. The battle for Seoul took a sudden and unexpected new turn at 20:09 on the night of 25 September 1950, when the following 10 Corps flash plane message was received at the CP of the 1st Marine Division. Info addressee, 10 Corps TAC Air Commander, reports enemy fleeing city of Seoul on road north of Uijongbu. He, TAC Air, is conducting heavy air attack and will continue the same. You will push attack now to the limit of your objectives in order to ensure maximum destruction of enemy forces. Signed, Almond. The Division G3 immediately called the Corps G3 for corroboration. Colonel Bowser questioned the ability of night air observation to determine whether the movement out of the city consisted of urban refugees or enemy troops. He was informed, however, that the intention of Corps was for the attack to begin at once. General Smith then called the 10 Corps Chief of Staff for confirmation, pointing out the inadvisability of attacking at night in an unfamiliar Oriental city of the size and complexity of Seoul, particularly as there was no indication of the enemy fleeing from the division front. But General Ruffner replied that General Almond himself had dictated the message and it was to be executed without delay. General Smith gave the attack order to the commanding officers of the 1st and 5th Marines, directing them to coordinate their efforts and confine them to avenues of advance which could be identified at night. His order was received by the 1st Marines at 22:05 and the 5th Marines at 22:15, just a few hours after the NKPA counterattack hit the 3rd Battalion of Murray's regiment. While the 2 rifle regiments made preparations to jump off, the order was relayed to the 7th and 11th Marines. Colonel Puller coordinated hastily with the 5th Marines and supporting arms for an attack scheduled to begin at 01:45 on 26 September, following a 15-minute artillery preparation. At 01:38, deciding that the preparation was inadequate, he notified the assault battalions to stand fast, preparatory fires to be repeated. A new jump-off time of 0200 was set, but at 01:53, a dramatic interruption came in the form of a flash message from 3rd Battalion of the 1st Marines. Lieutenant Colonel Ridge reported that a heavy enemy attack, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns, was moving down the main avenue leading from the center of the city to the southwest in the zone of the 1st Marines. It was the enemy's misfortune that 3-1 had sent out a patrol of 8 Marines and 3 natives under Corporal Charles E. Collins to make contact with a similar patrol from the 5th Marines. But at 01:30, the clamor of a firefight about 400 yards in front of 3-1 was followed by the return of members of the patrol who gave the alarm. Corporal Collins was still missing when Major Simmons heard the sound of tracked vehicles and was warned that 2 enemy tanks were approaching the George Company roadblock defended by heavy machine guns, 3.5-inch rocket launchers, and 75mm recoilless guns. These weapons accounted for the destruction of 1 enemy tank and the hasty retreat of the other. The division attack scheduled for 0200 was indefinitely postponed, of course, until 3-1, astride the principal avenue of approach, could deal with a large-scale enemy counterattack launched by an estimated battalion of infantry and about 12 tanks supported by self-propelled guns and mortars. A terrific concentration of Marine artillery was called down upon an NKPA effort that reached its peak about 0230. High-angle Marine howitzer and 81mm mortar fire almost literally blasted the attacking column out of existence, and enemy infantry action was negligible afterwards. At 03:15, the artillery liaison officer informed Puller that the 3 battalions of the 11th Marines must cease barrage fire at the penalty of burning out the tubes of their howitzers. During the comparative lull, the T-34s continued to attack at intervals until daybreak, and the last 2 tanks were killed at 0630. About that time, Corporal Collins returned safely after having been given up as dead. Exposed to friendly as well as enemy fire all night, he had made his way back through enemy-held areas in a disguise of Korean civilian garments. POW interrogation and examination of the ground revealed that 7 enemy tanks and 2 self-propelled guns were destroyed or disabled by Marine mines, rockets, mortars, or artillery. An estimated 475 to 500 infantry of the NKPA 25th Brigade had been killed and many more wounded, and the Marines took 83 prisoners at a relatively light cost in casualties. At 0500, as 3-1's fight in the city was tapering off, another Red force of battalion strength hit the 2nd Battalion, 32nd Infantry, on South Mountain. A section of the Army's unit's front was overrun, but a counterattack restored the line by 0700. Finally, driven from the ridge, the North Koreans left behind 394 dead and 174 prisoners, according to the regimental report. End of Chapter 13, Part 1, read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 13, Part 2 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Seoul as a battlefield. Entrapment of Dog Company, RCT-7. On the morning of 26 September, it may have occurred to some of the Marines that yesterday's announcement by 10 Corps of the capture of Seoul was a bit premature. The lines of the division remained where they were the night before, with only the difference that hundreds of enemy dead gave testimony of a busy night. Division Operation Order 12-50, issued at 12:30 on the 26th, directed a continuation of the attack on Seoul, the principal change from the last order being the commitment of the 7th Marines. This regiment, augmented by the Division Recon Company and the 5th KMC Battalion, was given the mission of pinching out the 5th Marines about 1,200 yards beyond Government Palace and attacking abreast of the 1st Marines toward the northeast. In the 7th zone of advance north of the city lay objectives Dog, northern half of Hill 338, Easy, Hill 342, Fox, Hill 133, George, Hill 343, and Baker, Hill 171, as rugged in order of terrain as any outfit could be served. Puller's regiment, with the 2nd KMC Battalion attached, would drive northward from Hills 97 and 82 in Lower Seoul, clear the center of the city, then wheel to the right to take objective Able, Hill 133 in the northeastern outskirts. The 5th Marines, with the 1st KMC Battalion attached, was to support Litzenberg's attack until being pinched out, whereupon it had orders to assemble in division reserve and relieve elements of the 7th Marines. The KMC regiment was still under orders to resume control of its detached battalions for the occupation of Seoul. The 3rd Battalion, however, was detached from the 1st Marine Division and ordered to report to the 3rd Battalion, 187th Airborne RCT, for operational control in Kumpo Peninsula operations. Responsibility for the security of Kimpo Airfield now rested upon 10 Corps. Thus, the Marine front prior to the assault formed a semicircle extending from the Kaesong Highway in the northwest to Hill 82 in the south, and the concave side faced Seoul like a giant scythe poised to mow down the last remnants of NKPA resistance. Colonel Litzenberg dispatched Dog Company of the 7th Marines southwest along the Kaesong Highway at 0630 on 26 September. The mission of the unit was to approach Seoul and make contact with the 5th Marines on the right. In the van of the column was the company machine gun officer, 1st Lieutenant William F. Goggin. For a while it seemed as though this untried unit was reaping the laurels earned by its battle-weary relatives of the 1st and 5th Marines, since hundreds of Koreans lined the highway to welcome the victors with resounding cheers. Progress was marked off rapidly in the absence of enemy resistance. The Marines passed through Hoingjeo-ri, and by 0900 the great slopes of Hill 296 loomed up on the right and those of 338 on the left. Tracing the road through the narrow valley between, the company approached the Sodemon prison at the northwest corner of Seoul. Suddenly the column came under machine gun fire from a high tower about 400 yards down the road. The initial burst caused several casualties, including Lieutenant Goggin, and the Marines quickly deployed on both sides of the road. Several more enemy machine guns and rifles opened up from hillside positions only 100 yards away. Since the throngs of well-wishers along the highway had prevented the use of flank guards, Company D was caught flat-footed in the low ground by the hail of lead. After a few minutes, the red weapons began firing from the lower slopes of Hills 296 and 338, directly to the flanks, and encirclement seemed imminent. Dog Company's commander, Captain Richard R. Breen, reacted by ordering the 2nd Platoon to attack the high ground around the prison. Simultaneously, 1st Lieutenant Paul P. Sartwell set up two 60mm mortars on the road and silenced one of the North Korean emplacements. Directing his crews from an exposed position, the young officer was wounded 3 times before finally being put out of action. 1st Lieutenant Edward H. Seeberger closed on the prison with his 2nd Platoon, while 1st Lieutenant Paul V. Mullaney's 1st ascended the slopes of Hill 338 on the left. The 3rd, under 1st Lieutenant James D. Hammond, Jr., remained in position along the road. When the assault platoons were stopped on the high ground by stiffening resistance, Company D settled down in an elongated perimeter for a battle of survival. There was no artillery support, but Marine air assisted by pounding the crescent of red positions. The S-3 of the 7th Marines, Major Raymond V. Friedrich, radioed Captain Breen and asked about the situation. Though now wounded himself, Breen stated that he could hold his ground. A small tank infantry column was dispatched from regiment to reach the beleaguered force with ammunition and supplies. By this time, however, the Reds had set up in the rear of Dog Company, and the relief force was turned back. Faced with the bleak fact that it was now surrounded, Company D withdrew 1,000 yards to a defensible road cut between Hills 296 and 338. The Marines completed the move with their wounded and dead at 1,600. After being resupplied by airdrop in their tight perimeter, they prepared grimly for an all-night stand. Elsewhere in the 7th Marine Zone, 26 September would be remembered as much for exhausting marches and climbs as for enemy contacts. In the morning, the 1st Battalion, under Lieutenant Colonel Davis, had taken over flank responsibility far to the northeast along the Kaesong Highway, thereby relieving the 2nd, less D Company, and 3rd for the advance on Seoul. The 2nd Battalion then moved out in trace of Dog Company, but according to plan veered leftward into the hills at Hongjo-ri, 1 mile short of the ambuscade. While 2-7 reconnoitered the high ground above the village, Major Roach's 3rd Battalion completed an 8.5-mile forced march to gain an assembly area in preparation for the assault of Northern Hill 338. At 1400, Fox and Easy companies of 2-7 attacked eastward from the height above Hongjo-ri to seize Hill 343. After an advance of 1,000 yards, they were stopped cold by heavy fire from the direction of Hill 338 to the south. Lieutenant Colonel Hinkle ordered 2-7 to dig in short of the objective, since any further progress would only make his right more vulnerable to the enemy guns on the flank. Captain Thomas E. Cooney led Company G of 3-7 through Hongjo-ri about 1700, circled the northern half of Hill 338, then launched a 2-platoon assault on the crest. His Marines gained the north summit against no opposition, but Company H, led by Captain Nicholas L. Shields, was taken under fire in a draw to the right and held up on the slopes for the night. Last fight on Hill 296. While the 7th Marines were fighting uphill on 26 September, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines punched downward in a bitter contest to clear the last NKPA resistance from the Hill 296 complex. The attack was launched early in the morning after preparatory fires by artillery and 81mm mortars. Item Company on the left was to sweep the remainder of the giant spur which descended into the very heart of Seoul. George, upon jumping off from the ridge above Hill 105N, would clear the low ground on Item's right. Dissatisfied with the accuracy of the preparatory barrages, and underestimating the enemy's strength and determination, Captain McMullen called off supporting arms and based the success of his 2-platoon assault on organic company weapons alone. No sooner had the Marines lunged downhill than great gaps were torn in the skirmish line by fire from swarms of North Koreans on the lower slopes. Both assault platoon leaders were wounded before an intermediate knoll was taken, and McMullen was forced to commit his reserve to bolster the hard-hit 3rd Platoon on the right. Continuing the attack under the personal leadership of its commander, the entire company waded into a maze of entrenchments manned by 200 enemy soldiers. In the close-in fighting that followed, the Reds were driven from their emplacements to seek cover farther down the spur. The depleted ranks of Item Company ground to a halt. There followed a brief calm, abruptly shattered when the North Koreans rallied and counterattacked uphill against the company's center. A wild melee enveloped the ridgeline, and the tactical situation gradually became a blur. Just as it seemed the Marines' hold on the lower spur would be pried loose, Lieutenant Williamson plowed into the tumult at the head of a small supply party. Ammunition distributed in the heat of the fighting tipped the scales in favor of the Marines, but not before McMullen was carried from the field as a result of his 7th battle wound in 2 wars. The heavy fighting finally eased toward the close of the day. Although the last organized defenses of the enemy were smashed, Company I was too badly battered to seize the tip of the spur before nightfall. Abreast on the right, 1st Lieutenant Charles D. Mize led Company G into defensive positions after a day of inching forward against stubborn opposition in the low ground. Other units of the 5th Marines experienced little action during 3-5's day-long engagement. While the 2nd Battalion mopped up in its zone south of the 3rd, the 1st KMC Battalion moved into position between the latter and the Reconnaissance Company, now manning the topographical peak of Hill 296 in the northwest. To the rear of 3-5, the 1st Battalion enjoyed a quiet interlude in regimental reserve. 1st Marines in the heart of Seoul. Early in the morning of 26 September, the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines moved out of reserve to pass through the 3rd on the streetcar line and continued the attack northward into the center of Seoul. On the right of Polar Zone, 1-1 prepared to descend Hill 82 and clear the main railroad station and adjoining slopes of South Mountain, where increasing enemy activity had been noted below the positions of the 32nd Infantry. Sutter's unit completed the passage of lines at 09 and attacked along the boulevard with Fox and Easy companies in the assault. Leading the advance up the street were the tanks of Baker Company, Cummings M26s in the van. The young officer's machine had proceeded only a few yards when it struck an American M6 mine, overlooked by Marine engineers while they were removing their hasty field of the previous night. Not only did the explosion wreck the tank, but it also caused several casualties among the infantry on either side. The attack edged forward in the 2nd day of the Battle of the Barricades. Every 200 to 300 yards, fanatical Red detachments manned rice bag barriers about 8 feet high and 5 feet thick, stretching the whole width of the street. It fell to the M26s to smash the emplacements and silence the NKPA anti-tank guns behind each one. Marine tank action, in turn, hinged on mine clearance by supporting engineers, who looked to flanking infantry for covering fire. Thus was a system of 3-party teamwork developed and perfected during the roar of battle. Aiding the communists behind the barricades were other North Koreans who fired their rifles and submachine guns from rooftops, windows, and side streets. The Marine infantry, therefore, had to defend in every direction as it attacked to the front. Intense heat from burning buildings along the street added to the handicaps, and the constant discovery of South Korean civilians, including women and children, huddled in the rubble further strained the taut nerves of men who looked for trouble from every quarter. It was a dirty, frustrating fight every yard of the way, perhaps best described by Puller himself, who reported that progress was agonizingly slow. A principal deterrent to speed was the fact that all supporting tanks simultaneously expended their ammunition and fuel, so that all had to return to the rear for replenishment at the same time. During their absences from the fight, the infantry understandably chose to await their return rather than pay heavily in casualties by assaulting barricades with small arms alone. At one point in the street battle, an enemy soldier darted from behind a building and charged a flame tank advancing behind two lead M26s. Ignoring the Marine infantrymen, who gaped in disbelief, the North Korean hurled a huge satchel charge over the engine compartment of the armored vehicle, then escaped unharmed as the explosion rocked the area. The flame tank was wrecked, but the crew escaped serious injury with the assistance of supporting infantry. Apparently, a suicide squad of NKPA demolitions men had been assigned the mission of destroying Marine armor in this fashion, for several other Red soldiers tried single-handed assaults shortly afterwards. The riflemen of 2-1 were alert for the later attempts, however, and the enemy fanatics were cut down before inflicting further damage. The crucial period in the 2nd Battalion's day-long firefight came as Captain Goodwin C. Groff's Fox Company approached a street junction below Hill 97. It had been planned that this unit would advance through the intersection and continue along the streetcar line, while Company E, moving behind in column, veered off on the right branch. Enemy resistance against Fox's advance proved so fierce that Captain Norman R. Stanford bypassed the fork and threw Easy Company's weight in support of the other unit. The North Korean strongpoint crumbled under the two-company onslaught, but not before Stanford and several others were added to the casualty rolls. By dark, 2-1 had measured off a hard-won gain of 1,200 yards. Lieutenant Colonel Sutter ordered the battalion into defensive positions astride the boulevard a scant 100 yards from the tip of the ridge spur which was costing Item Company, 5th Marines, so dearly. In the right half of Puller Zone on 26 September, the 1st Battalion stamped out a hornet's nest around the main railroad station, nestled at the foot of South Mountain. Charlie Company had led off the early morning attack in the wake of a preparation by air, artillery, and mortars. After descending Hill 82 in a column of platoons, the company formed on line along a stream paralleling the rail yard. Then, at a signal from Captain Ray, the platoons crossed over, wheeled to the north, and advanced up the tracks by leaps and bounds. Though the overall intensity of enemy resistance in this quarter could be termed only moderate, the random deployment of the Reds among buildings and train cars made the going slow and costly for the Marines. After clearing out the yard, the attackers converged on the station house itself and drove the last North Koreans from the building during a sharp exchange. The interior of the bullet-pocked structure produced only a handful of enemy dead, but in one corner were heaped the bodies of several South Korean women and children. It was obvious that the latter had been gunned by communist executioners, since their sheltered location within the building was ample protection against the small arms of the advancing Marines. By darkness, Company C was in undisputed control of the railroad terminal, a patrol led by Lieutenant Carlin having mopped up the fringe area. To the right, Company A had secured the Park Promontory on the northwestern tip of South Mountain in conjunction with Baker Company's drive, which included the nose jutting out below. East of the 1st Marines, the 32nd Infantry Zone was the scene of considerable activity throughout 26 September. After the 2nd Battalion repulsed the enemy's pre-dawn counterattack, the 3rd jumped off at 0800 from positions a mile and a half east of South Mountain. Its objective, Hill 106, lay more than 3,000 yards away, just south of the highway leading eastward out of Seoul. Approaching the base of the ridge, Company L surprised and destroyed a strong NKPA position, while Company I swept up the objective itself against light opposition. Reaching the summit, the company commander called an airstrike on an enemy column marching out of Seoul on the highway. As the planes broke up the Red formation, Company L, reinforced with tanks and additional infantry, drove down the road to mop up and block the escape route. In the day-long attack, 332 and its supporting armament accounted for 500 enemy dead, 5 tanks, 45 vehicles, 3 artillery pieces, and 2 ammunition dumps, according to regimental reports. The remainder of the 32nd, now augmented by the 2nd Battalion 17th Infantry, in addition to the 17th ROC, saw spots of heavy fighting during the mop-up and consolidation on and around South Mountain. Casualties for the 32nd, as reported on 26 September, were 6 KIA, 92 WIA, and 3 MIA. Most of those reported the following day, 32 KIA, 33 WIA, and 9 MIA, could also be traced to action on the 26th. Thus, the Army Regiment, having been impressively blooded in its 8 days of action, could lay claim to clearing both South Mountain and that 15% of Seoul's built-up area east of the Great Height. In the course of the day, the 1st Marines had made patrol contact with the 5th Marines in the left rear and with Army elements atop South Mountain on the right flank. Prospects for the morrow appeared much brighter at division and corps levels, where there must have existed some apprehension over the complicated maneuvering which had denied the attackers a solid front until they were in the heart of the sprawling capital. Objective secured. The 27th of September dawned as the day of reckoning. Applicable to the tactical situation in Seoul was the old law of physics, that 2 bodies cannot occupy the same space at the same time. With 10 corps troops pouring into the city and environs to share them with the communist garrison, it was axiomatical that one side or the other would shortly have to go. Oddly enough, despite the electrified atmosphere, the night of 26 to 27 September had passed quietly, even for Dog Company, 7th Marines, isolated in the road cut between Hills 296 and 338. At dawn, a tank infantry team supported by engineers of Company D, 1st Engineer Battalion, advanced down the Kaesong Highway against negligible resistance and escorted the beleaguered company back to the 7th Marine CP at Hoingjo-ri. While the anticlimactical rescue was taking place, the 3rd Battalion jumped off in the attack, supported by fire from the 2nd on the left, to clear the northern reaches of Hill 338. Howe Company pressed forward up the draw on George's right, but was stalled by heavy fire which suddenly erupted on the slopes above. The 3rd Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Paul E. Denny, broke through in its zone, only to be recalled by Shields when the rest of the company failed to regain the lost momentum. Captain Richard H. Sengewald's Item Company, en route to take positions on the left of George, paused to assist Shields' outfit for a short time. After further attempts by Company H to gain the summit were unsuccessful, Sengewald led his unit to the north and attacked the right flank of the NKPA elements scattered indiscriminately over the remote humps of Hill 338. The situation on the northern half of the towering objective did not change appreciably in the course of the day. Colonel Litzenberg developed further pressure against the enemy's right by ordering 2-7 to continue the attack against Hill 343 in mid-morning. On the right of the battalion zone, Captain Walter D. Phillips, Jr. led Company E forward in the face of stubborn enemy resistance from the crest. Owing to steady North Korean fire and the rugged terrain, gains were measured off by the yard, both for Phillips's unit and for Captain Elmer J. Zorn's Fox Company on the left. By nightfall, nevertheless, the Marines had mastered the situation to the extent that Company E sat firmly entrenched atop Hill 343, 2,500 yards from its starting point. More force was applied to Litzenberg's flanking lever north of Seoul when Company G was withdrawn from its ridgeline on Hill 338 in order to attack eastward to seize Hill 342, which loomed above the Capitol building in the northern tip of Seoul. Circling through the low ground north of Hill 338, the company passed safely through an extensive minefield that had been conveniently marked off by friendly South Koreans. As the Marines approached the base of their objective and came under heavy sniper fire, Captain Cooney ordered the 1st Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Arthur R. Mooney, to set up a base of fire on intermediate high ground in order to support an assault by the 2nd and 3rd. The plan backfired, for the 1st platoon became engaged in a hot firefight as it moved toward the designated position. The 2 assault units fared no better when, without the expected covering fire, they were hit by a hail of lead on the lower slopes of Hill 342. Several officers and NCOs were killed or wounded within a matter of minutes, and the scattered fighting that continued until nightfall brought about no significant change in the local situation. Thus, the day ended on Lichtenberg's Seoul front, with the 7th Marines in control of Hill 343, but sharing parts of 338 and 342 with the NKPA. The story would not be complete, however, without a brief visit to the regiment's Hwangju front, several miles to the west, which had crackled with activity during the early afternoon. About 1200, a company of North Koreans emerged from the northern hills and attacked toward the old ferry crossing at Hill 125. On the way, the Reds had the misfortune to stumble into Captain David W. Banks's Able Company of 17, manning a blocking position at Ryokoku. To avoid the danger of infiltration in the bustling bridgehead, Lieutenant Colonel Davis promptly committed Company C under Captain Richard F. Delmar III. Despite their disadvantages in numbers and firepower, the dogged Reds extended the fight sufficiently to involve even a platoon of Captain Myron E. Wilcox's Baker Company. After a prolonged clatter, the engagement ended almost as abruptly as it had begun, and the immediate result was that all communist troops above the ferry site withdrew to Kaesong. The 7th Marines claimed 375 enemy killed and 34 taken prisoner in the fighting, which ranged its vast front from 23 to 27 September. The spoils of war included the strangely unbalanced assortment of 4 machine guns, 6 rifles, and 600 bayonets. While the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of Lichtenberg's regiment struggled among the massive ridges north of Seoul on the 27th, the 1st and 5th Marines struck at the vital nerve center of the rock capital. The regimental attacks through the center of the city began as separate thrusts in the morning, but as the day wore on, they took on aspects of a coordinated foot race. It could even be said, finally, that the battle became a flag-raising contest between the 2 Marine units, as the last NKPA resistance died in heaps of rubble and torn rice bags. At 0645, the 3rd Battalion 5th Marines jumped off to clear the tip of Hill 296's troublesome eastern spur. For the first time and longer than they cared to remember, the infantrymen were greeted not by a sheet of small arms and machine gun fire, but by occasional, erratic pops from the rifles of dispirited snipers. Groping through the smoke and haze boiling up from the shattered city, Companies G and I swept the high ground by 0730 and, at long last, slowly filtered through the first streets of western Seoul. In short order, they were encountering the expected barricades and minefields. There was a hint of stiffening opposition, but it quickly dissolved as the riflemen, backed by supporting tanks and engineers, ground forward relentlessly. By 0930, George Company made contact with the 1st Marines on the right. Less than an hour later, after wheeling northward, 3-5 controlled middle school and adjacent high ground, the springboard for the assault on the Capitol building 1,000 yards away. At 1200, Lieutenant Colonel Taplett ordered Companies G and I to continue the attack, guiding on the 2 red flags which whipped the wind defiantly on both sides of the great dome ahead. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion moved up behind and prepared to advance on the left of the 3rd. Its mission in the final assault was to seize the craggy peak of Hill 338, which reared upward on the left of the Capitol building like a grim fortress. On the right of the 5th Regiment, the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines had smashed through another series of rice bag barriers on the boulevard, and at 10:57, the United States colors unfurled above the French consulate. A furious fight exploded around the city's main intersection, where the principal streetcar lines crossed to form an X not far from middle school. Company D, spearheading 2-1's drive, waded into the fray with determination. Lieutenant Cummings, who by this time appeared to have a remarkable affinity for heavy trouble, again lost his tank to enemy mines, but not before he had knocked out 2 Russian 76mm self-propelled guns emplaced in the middle of the intersection. Staff Sergeant McDonald's M26 obliterated an NKPA truck with 2 90mm rounds when the vehicle tried to escape with a howitzer and its crew. The afternoon of 27 September was a time of climax as the 1st Marine Division front surged forward of middle school and the central intersection. Though beaten and faltering, the North Koreans still managed to fight stubbornly here and there, but their overall deployment no longer bore any semblance of tactical integrity. By early afternoon, the Reds facing the 5th Marines broke and fled. Troops of 3-5 poured into the government compound, their final objective, and secured it at 1508. The North Korean flags were struck, and in their place rose the United States colors. Somewhat awed by the historic import of their accomplishment, young Marine riflemen wonderingly probed the spacious halls and chambers of the huge building that shortly would be reoccupied by the government of the Korean Republic. On the left of the 3rd Battalion, Company A of 1-5 had launched its attack on Hill 338 at 1300 in the wake of devastating preparations by air, artillery, and mortars. 2nd Lieutenant Nicholas M. Trapnell led off with the 1st Platoon, which seized an intermediate piece of high ground against moderate resistance. The 2nd Platoon, under 2nd Lieutenant Edward E. Collins, then drove forward on the left of the ancient wall leading to the crest of the objective, but the attack was stopped by heavy mortar and small arms fire. Marine air thundered down to rake the target with machine guns and rockets. The ground troops followed up with heavy concentrations of 60mm and 81mm mortars. Moving closely behind the supporting fire, the 1st Platoon overran a knob situated below the dominating peak. The 2nd Platoon then resumed its advance on the left of the wall, and the 3rd, under Technical Sergeant George W. Balco, took the lead on the right. It was the latter unit that smashed through the last resistance and secured the cliffs at the summit of Hill 338 at 1850. While the 5th Marines completed its final mission in Seoul, 2-1 on the right continued along the streetcar line, which curved below the government buildings to run eastward to the far edge of the city. Since the 7th Marines had been slowed in the hills north of the capital, the expected tie-in on the left flank did not occur, and Puller's troops had to go it alone through the dense maze of streets in eastern Seoul. At 1530, infantrymen of 2-1 raised the American flag over the Russian consulate, just to the right of the curve in the boulevard. 7 minutes later, the flag also waved above the United States consulate, about 350 yards farther off on the flank. To the right of 2-1, the 1st Battalion was making good progress after a slow start against stiff opposition. Charlie Company had been held up at the outset in the neighborhood of the railroad station, but supporting tanks, including flamethrowers, had paved the way by blasting and burning a formidable nest of NKPA automatic weapons and AT guns. One armored vehicle was disabled by a mine and another by anti-tank fire before the Marines finally broke through. As the battalion pivoted eastward in accordance with the general plan, both Charlie Company and Able on the right hammered through the usual barricades and suicide detachments. The 32nd Infantry and elements of the 17th enjoyed a relatively quiet day on and around South Mountain, for these units had only to hold firm in their positions until the 1st Marines could complete its wheeling movement and come abreast, facing east. Shortly before 1630, 2-1 was pounding eastward through a stretch of the streetcar line south of the government compound. Fire poured into the ranks of Dog Company from 3 sides, and Marines sweltered in the heat of burning buildings that offered dubious protection. Corsairs screamed down to plaster enemy positions only a block ahead of the foremost infantry. Immediately after each pass by the Gullwing Plains, 2nd Lieutenant Carl B. Thompson, Jr. led his 1st platoon in the assault with covering fire provided by supporting tanks. There was a final surge up the street by the green-clad riflemen and barmen, and then it was all over. At 16:30, enemy resistance across the 1st Regiment's front abruptly collapsed, with the result that the Battle of Seoul came to an end. Snipers and bypassed pockets remained to be mopped up by the Marines, KMC units, and South Korean police, but the NKPA had clearly quit the fight and abandoned the city. The 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 1st Marines marched rapidly through desultory sniper fire to the eastern part of town, where they dug in for the night. End of Chapter 13, Part 2, read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 14, Part 1 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Drive to Uijongbu. As rapidly as the advance of the troops permitted, preparations were made for the restoration of civil government to Seoul. A group of former city officials had arrived by plane from Pusan, and on 26 September, Mayor Lee opened a temporary office in Yongdungpo. The police chief, construction engineer, and the health and welfare officials also resumed their old duties. Collecting points were set up for handling the civilian wounded. The following statistics, comprising the patients treated for all causes by the 1st Medical Battalion of the 1st Marine Division, show that Korean civilians were second in numbers only to the Marines themselves. U.S. Marine, 2,811. Korean civilian, 1,908. U.S. Army, 358. KMC and ROC, 322. U.S. Navy, 78. POW, 39. The problem of food for a city with a pre-war population of 1.5 million was met during the advance when stores of rice and other supplies were turned over to Seoul officials by the Marines. Medical supplies found in the city were redistributed for use in Seoul and Incheon hospitals, as well as the hospital established at Yongdungpo by Captain Herring, the division surgeon, expressly for the treatment of civilian wounded. A shipment of some 50 tons of rice through 10 Corps, plus large amounts located in Seoul by the Marines, enabled the officials to take over without critical food shortages. On the 28th, Mayor Lee moved into the City Hall at Seoul and acted immediately to reestablish police authority, clear destroyed areas, and provide for the restoration of such public utilities as water and electricity. These prompt measures did much to ease the hardships of thousands of returning refugees. Operations of 28 September. The 5th Marines passed an uneventful day on 28 September, having taken its assigned objectives and been pinched out by the 1st Marines on the right and the 7th Marines on the left, as planned. An assembly area was established in the vicinity of the Women's University, and though the regiment sent out patrols, no enemy were encountered. The 7th Marines put in a busy day at seizing objectives which consisted of the high ground north of Seoul on both sides of the main highway from the capital to Uijongbu. Opposition was light to moderate, with the stiffest resistance occurring in areas which indicated that the enemy intended to put up a fight to protect his escape route to Uijongbu. 75 tons of American-made dynamite and explosives, captured by the 7th Marines, were believed to have been originally supplied to the ROC forces before the war and abandoned during the NKPA invasion. Total advances for the day ranged from 1,500 yards in the zone of the 3rd Battalion to 2,600 yards in the zone of the 2nd Battalion. When the 1st Marines jumped off at 0645 on the 28th, the 1st and 2nd Battalions were in assault. The 3rd Battalion remained in an assembly area in the rear and continued mopping up along with the 2nd KMC Battalion. Although organized resistance in the city had been broken, the 1st Battalion met stubborn resistance from enemy groups and encountered many mines. The 2nd Battalion, on the left, made headway against light opposition. These attacks cleared the remainder of Seoul and took the assault battalions to Hill 133, Objective Able, commanding the city on the northeast. General Smith visited the CPs of all 3 regiments on the 28th by helicopter. He found Colonel Puller at the Dak-Soo Palace near the intersection of the streetcar lines. Colonel Litzenberg's CP was located a short distance to the west, and Lieutenant Colonel Murray had established his headquarters in the Women's University on the northwest outskirts of the city. Later that day, General Smith and Craig displaced the division CP from Oyo-So-ri to a barracks area in Seoul, southwest of South Mountain. The 2 Marine generals took over a former infirmary, but they decided that the mortuary slab was too depressing and had that fixture removed. Liberation ceremonies at Seoul. Planning for impressive liberation ceremonies at Seoul had begun while the street fighting was at its height. The 1st Marine Division was requested by Corps to furnish 2 honor guards and a band. Musical instruments having been left behind in Japan, air shipment was prescribed. General MacArthur had hoped to hold the liberation ceremony at Seoul on 25 September, just 3 months to the day after the launching of the NKPA invasion. The enemy, however, was not cooperative with respect to this date, and even on the morning of the 29th, 3 NKPA counterattacks were repulsed on the outskirts of the city. As it proved, General MacArthur vetoed plans for a ceremony with band music. "I will personally conduct the proceedings without being introduced," said his message to 10 Corps, and he specified that there be no honor guard. 2 pre-dawn counterattacks on the 2nd Battalion 1st Marines were not auspicious beginnings for the day of the liberation exercises. The first occurred at 0445 on 29 September, when the OP, located on a spur projecting forward of the MLR and defended by a rifle platoon, was infiltrated by an estimated 70 to 100 NKPA troops. A second enemy attack hit the left flank of the battalion shortly afterwards. Both attempts were repulsed with a total loss of 48 to the Communists, and the Marines had casualties of 4 KIA and 28 WIA, most of them resulting from hand grenades. Another assault, launched by the enemy at 0600 in the zone of action of the 7th Marines, was repulsed without trouble. Most of the fighting on 29 September was done by this regiment, which pushed forward to gain all the rest of its objectives before nightfall. At dawn, in preparation for the liberation ceremony, Marine Guards were unobtrusively stationed along the route of approach from the new floating bridge to the government palace. This duty fell chiefly on 3-1, with elements of the 5th Marines being responsible for security in the western part of the city. General MacArthur and President Syngman Rhee drove directly to the palace after separate arrivals at Kimpo Airfield. The guests included Korean dignitaries and United Nations officials, in addition to high-ranking representatives of military organizations. The Commander-in-Chief opened the ceremony with a moving 5-minute address ending with the Lord's Prayer. The rumble of artillery could be heard at times, and some of the guests glanced up apprehensively at the shattered skylight overhead. "Occasional falls of glass from the dome and drifting smoke and ashes were part of the scene," commented a Marine officer. Unheeded noise of rifle shots punctuated the talks. Grim Marines from Puller's regiment surrounded the seated audience. The youth of the Guards was offset by the tall, gray-haired figures of General Smith and Barr at the front of the audience. They were patently the men who had borne precisely and capably the load of decision. With the 1st Marine Division still responsible for security, it was a relief to General Smith when the distinguished visitors departed unharmed. Not all the mines had been removed from the streets as yet, and it was suspected that snipers might still be lurking in the ruins. Crumbling of NKPA resistance. Although more hard fighting lay ahead in the Inchon-Seoul operation, 10 Corps alerted its major units on 29 September to the possibility of a new amphibious landing on the east coast of Korea. This was one of the earliest announcements of the planning which led to the Wonsan landing and the advance to the chosen reservoir, but the history of those events belongs in the next volume of this series. The new operation was suggested by the rapid disintegration of the main body of the NKPA invasion forces. In a single day, 26 September, elements of the 1st Cavalry Division had advanced more than 100 miles, and a total of about 23,600 prisoners were taken by the 8th Army before the end of the month. Enemy resistance was still encountered, to be sure, and sometimes it was of a desperate nature as Red Korean troops fought to escape encirclement. But all hope and heart had gone out of the communist cause. One 8th Army column sliced across the peninsula to Kunsan, while other spearheads drove northward and ROK units pushed up the east coast nearly to Samchak. NKPA opposition was crumbling everywhere as demoralized invasion troops threw away their weapons and changed to civilian clothes in the hope of making their way to North Korea through the ever-tightening 8th Army cordon. The 10 Corps troops in the Seoul area had enough on their hands to finish the old operation before starting a new one. 1st Marine Division Operation Order 13-50, issued at 2000 on 29 September, provided for the securing of the captured city by these means. 1. A continuation of the attack to the east. 2. The conduct of reconnaissance in force to the north and northwest. 3. The relief of elements of the 7th Infantry Division north of the River Han. 4. The seizure of prescribed blocking positions. The division plan of maneuver called for the 3 Marine Rifle Regiments to take blocking positions forming a rough semicircle defending Seoul from 3 sides, the 5th Marines to the northwest, the 7th Marines to the north, and the 1st Marines to the northeast. Responsibility for the area north of the Han River and west of the Pusan River had passed to the 1st Marine Division, and at 1500 on 30 September, the following missions were assigned by Operation Order 14-50. RCT-1. To protect the right flank of the division and be prepared to assemble in division reserve by battalions for a motor lift. Blocking positions, as assigned by Operation Order 13-50, consisted of high ground from 2 to 5 miles northeast of Seoul. RCT-5. To continue reconnaissance in force with minimum of a reinforced battalion to Suyuhyun and establish a blocking position, to protect the left flank of the division, and to be prepared to provide a reinforced rifle company for Task Force Kumpo on order. These attachments to be made: 1st Battalion 11th Marines and 1 battery of 50th AAA Battalion U.S. Army, Company A 1st Tank Battalion, Company A 1st Engineer Battalion, and a company from the 1st Motor Transport Battalion. RCT-7. To advance rapidly and seize blocking positions in the vicinity of Uijongbu. These attachments to be made: 3rd Battalion 11th Marines and 1 battery of 50th AAA Battalion U.S. Army, Company D 1st Tank Battalion, and 1 company of the KMC Regiment. The KMC Regiment, less the 1st and 3rd Battalions and 1 company of the 5th Battalion, with a detachment of Anglico attached, was meanwhile to advance to the east and seize blocking positions at the junction of the Han and Pusan rivers, where the road leading northeast from Seoul reaches that point. The 1st KMC Battalion had been attached to the 7th Infantry Division, and the 3rd Battalion was operating on the Kumpo Peninsula. Task Force Kumpo, when activated on division order, was to consist of the 3rd KMC Battalion and Battery C 50th AAA Battalion, U.S. Army, plus a 5th Marines Rifle Company and a tank detachment, if required. As it proved, however, 10 Corps held responsibility for the defense of this area until 2 October, when the 187th Airborne RCT was relieved by Task Force Kumpo. 2 more small firefights awaited the 5th Marines in carrying out the mission assigned by Division Operation Order 14-50. At 10:30 on 1 October, while patrolling the extensive area of regimental responsibility, a detachment of 2-5 made contact with an NKPA force estimated at 150 to 200 men. Airstrikes and mortar fire soon took the fight out of the enemy, who left 30 dead behind. At 0600 on 1 October, the 3rd Battalion, reinforced with a battery of artillery and a platoon of tanks and engineers, moved out towards Uijongbu. Charlie Company of 1-5 followed in trace to protect the battalion rear and provided security for returning motor transport. 2 roadblocks were cleared before the battalion tied in for the night on high ground just short of the objective. Then at 0230 the next morning, the enemy struck in estimated company strength. The attempt was repulsed by machine gun fire, and 67 Red Korean bodies were found at daybreak in the attack area. At 0700, the column resumed the march to Uijongbu, which was occupied without further incident. The 1st Marines found little difficulty in carrying out all missions assigned by Division Operation Order 14-50. In fact, the regiment had only a few minor patrol actions after taking blocking positions northeast of Seoul. Colonel Litzenberg's men were now making the main effort of the 1st Marine Division. Preparations for the drive to Uijongbu began with every indication that the enemy was bent upon flight. A patrol from the 3rd Battalion found 30 Korean bodies beside a wall, including several women and a child, whose hands had been bound behind them before they were shot. The victims, according to a POW, were members of the families of ROK soldiers. Positions had been consolidated by the late afternoon of 30 September in readiness for the jump-off in the morning. The 7th Marines might well have been called Task Force Litzenberg at this stage, for it was reinforced by Major Pari's 3rd Battalion of the 11th Marines, Captain Lester T. Chase's Company D of the 1st Tank Battalion, Captain Byron C. Turner's Company D of the 1st Engineer Battalion, and Captain Kim's Company C of the 5th KMC Battalion. The drive to the new objective began at 0630 on 1 October in a column of battalions. Air reconnaissance had made it appear likely that any NKPA resistance would probably take advantage of a tactical bottleneck about halfway to Uijongbu, where steep and rocky ridges overlooked a narrow defile through which the road passed. Colonel Litzenberg and his staff decided to maneuver by sending the 1st Battalion to make a broad feint to cover the entry of the 3rd Battalion into the defile with tank support while the 2nd Battalion followed in reserve. Lieutenant Colonel Davis secured his preliminary objectives, then swiftly spread out on both sides of the defile for his feint. Unfortunately, Major Roach was delayed by an enemy minefield, which brought the 3rd Battalion and the tanks to a halt while the engineers cleared the way. Davis's simulated attack had meanwhile disclosed that the enemy was entrenched in depth along the high ground on each side of the defile. Both Marine battalions took heavy NKPA artillery and mortar fire before halting for the night. At least the day's attacks had unmasked the enemy's positions and exposed them to savage attacks by the Corsairs of VMF 312. RCT-7 continued the attack at 0630 on the 2nd, with Roach on the left of the road and Davis on the right. About halfway through the defile, the 3rd Battalion was pinned down by a concentration of NKPA artillery, mortar, and small arms fire. Again, the tanks were held up while the engineers cleared away mines, working in a hail of bullets. The tanks of the 1st Platoon repaid the favor by closing in on 2 huts sheltering NKPA troops and killing an estimated 35. Here an attached dozer tank, without blade, had a freakish accident when 2 men in the turret were wounded by enemy fire down a 105mm gun tube while the breach was open. The 1st Battalion managed to cross the stream east of the defile and seize the high ground just beyond. But the day ended with gains of only 300 yards in the defile. Roach's men returned to the attack in the morning, supported by the tanks of the 2nd Platoon. Again, VMF 312 flew one close air support sortie after another. Major Charles E. McLean was hit by enemy AA fire but crash-landed his plane in friendly territory. First Lieutenant Robert O. Crocker was killed in action shortly after being brought down by NKPA small arms fire. VMF 312 flyers intercepted an enemy convoy, and First Lieutenant Franklin Stratton reported the destruction of 7 out of 8 trucks. The tanks also gave the infantry helpful support, firing 167 90mm rounds during the day and an estimated 20,000 machine gun rounds at enemy troops along the ridge. While 1-7 cleared the high ground on the east side of the road and 3-7 on the west side, Colonel Litzenberg directed Major Webb D. Sawyer to pass between them with 2-7 and drive directly along the highway. Progress was satisfactory from the start. When Sawyer's men began to overrun abandoned NKPA artillery pieces and supply dumps, they pounded ahead with the realization that enemy resistance was broken. At 5 that afternoon, the 2nd Battalion entered the ruins of Uijongbu, evacuated by the enemy. The last large-scale fight of the Inchon-Seoul operation had ended in a smashing victory for the division's youngest regiment. Indications showed that the Marines had been opposed by 3 battalions of the 31st Regiment of the 31st NKPA Division. Elements of the 17th and Seoul Divisions and of an artillery battalion were also encountered. These troops had been supported by 13 tanks, of which 4 were killed by Marine air attacks and 2 captured in a damaged condition by 2-7 after the others escaped. The 3-mile advance of RCT-7 on 3 October had resulted in the cutting of lateral communications to the east and west of Uijongbu and the securing of an important blocking position on the 10-Corps final phase line. Losses of 13 killed and 111 wounded were suffered by the regiment in the 3-day fight. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Read by Aaron Bennett. Chapter 14, Part 2 of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Drive to Uijongbu. The Last Days of Inchon-Seoul Operation. The climax of the battle was witnessed by General Cates, who visited the front on 3 October, accompanied by Major Generals Edwin A. Pollock and Clayton C. Jerome. After being briefed at the Division CP by the G1, G2, G3, and G4, the Commandant inspected the positions of RCT-1 and RCT-5 by helicopter before taking a jeep tour along the road to Uijongbu to watch Colonel Litzenberg's men slug their way forward into the battered town. That evening the fighting virtually came to an end, for the 1st Marine Division had a total of only 7 casualties during the last 4 days of the Inchon-Seoul operation. The rifle regiments had only to maintain their blocking positions while patrolling to the front and flank. Operations on the Kumpo Peninsula, which had been sputtering intermittently ever since the occupation of the airfield, also drew to a close. Responsibility for the area having passed from Corps back to Division on 2 October, elements of the 187th Airborne RCT were relieved by Task Force Kumpo, consisting of the 3rd KMC Battalion, a detachment from the 1st Signal Battalion, and Battery C of the 50th AAA Battalion, U.S. Army. Naval gunfire had found its greatest mission of the exploitation phase in support of the widely assorted units which protected the left flank of 10 Corps at various times. The 187th, being short on artillery, had relied on the naval gunfire and spot teams commanded by Lieutenant J.G. Leo D. McMillan, U.S. Navy, and First Lieutenant J.E. Dolan of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines. These officers and their men remained with Task Force Kumpo after it relieved the 187th, but patrols reported no enemy contacts after 2 October. The chief activity on the peninsula was listening to the baseball games of the World Series, which came in clearly over the radios of the naval gunfire teams. As directed on 5 October by Operation Order 15-50, the last to be issued by the division in the Inchon-Seoul operation, the major Marine units were scheduled to close into staging areas in Incheon as follows. 5th Marines, 1800 on 5 October. 11th Marines, 1700 on 6 October. 1st Marines, prior to darkness, 6 October. 7th Marines, mid-afternoon, 7 October. KMC Regiment, prior to darkness, 7 October. An impressive ceremony was held on the 6th, when the cemetery established by the Marines on the outskirts of Incheon was taken over by the United Nations. After an invocation by Chaplain R.M. Schweihart of the 1st Marine Division, General Allman made a few remarks and laid a wreath on the grave of an unknown soldier. Then General Smith, General Barr, and Colonel Lee performed the same ceremony over Marine, Army, and rock graves. Volleys were fired, taps were sounded, and the dedication ended with the national anthems of the United States and Korea. There could be no doubt, as the Marines prepared to mount out for a new amphibious operation, that the NKPA invaders had been knocked out of the war by the combined 10 Corps and 8th Army offensives. The Red Korean retreat had become a rout, and Marine staff officers considered it doubtful whether the enemy could hold the east coast port of Wonsan long enough to defend it against the proposed new Marine assault landing. It was apparent, in fact, that only the active intervention of Red China or the Soviet Union could save the North Korean People's Republic from imminent collapse. At this time, however, it did not seem likely that any such attempt would be made. And so it was that one of the most remarkable amphibious operations in Marine Corps annals came uneventfully to an end on 7 October 1950. Early in the morning, the Division CP displaced from Seoul to a housing area just north of Ascom City. At 0935, in accordance with 10 Corps Operation Order 5, General Smith reported to Admiral Doyle, Comfib 1, for duty as commander of the landing forts for the proposed Wonsan assault. And at 1200, the Inchon-Seoul operation passed into history when the last troops of the 7th Marines were relieved in the Uijongbu area by elements of the 8th Army. Summaries and conclusions. At this stage, the men of the 1st Marine Division and 1st Marine Aircraft Wing were still too close to the operation to see it clearly in detail. If there was any one overwhelming impression they all had in common, it was a sense of the speed with which events had raced toward a climax. This was by no means an illusion. Hundreds of Marine reservists had watched baseball games or enjoyed picnics with their families on the 4th of July, never dreaming that shortly after Labor Day they would be scrambling out of landing boats to assault a flaming Asiatic seaport on the other side of the earth. Speed was an essential if the assault landing were to be completed on the prescribed D-Day. But there was no place for the proverbial haste that leads to waste. It had to be the speed of precision, an acceleration of men and events made possible by the amphibious know-how of a Navy Marine Corps team that had worked together throughout the Pacific operations of World War II. Sometimes this acceleration was so unobtrusive as to pass almost unnoticed. Shipping does not grow on trees, particularly the enormous amounts of shipping required for a major amphibious operation. Yet the U.S. Navy made it appear a simple and routine matter to assemble from all the 7 seas an invasion fleet made up of craft ranging from cruisers to rowboats. The Marines, as the landing force, worked hand in hand with the attack force commanded by Rear Admiral James H. Doyle, who had no superior in the world of 1950 as an amphibious specialist. From preliminary planning to final execution, Doyle and his staff officers of Fib 1 supplied a precision which had much to do with the success of an operation holding so many potentialities of disaster. Looking back, some of the Marine participants could hardly recall a full night's sleep from 25 July 1950, the date of the order directing that the 1st Marine Division be brought up to full war strength, until 7 October 1950, when the operation came to a victorious end. From the mobilization at Camp Pendleton to the street fighting in Seoul, it was often necessary to utilize the hours of darkness ordinarily devoted to rest. At Kobe, for instance, there were so few copies of the plans for the Inchon Landing that they were circulated on a 24-hour schedule for study by Marine officers who took turns. The acceleration of the 1st Marine Division in 64 days from a peacetime basis to the capture of Seoul has been summarized as follows. A. Expansion from a reduced peace strength, less the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, to a reinforced war strength, less 1 RCT, was completed in a period of approximately 15 days. B. Administrative sea lift and movement of over 15,000 personnel, organic equipment, and partial resupply from San Diego to the Far East Command commenced in less than 3 weeks after expansion was ordered. C. Debarkation and unloading from administrative shipping and re-embarkation and reloading at Kobe, Japan for the assault landing at Inchon were done in a period averaging about 7 days per unit, 2 days of which were lost due to a heavy typhoon in the Kobe area. D. Completed planning and the issuance of the complete operation order for the amphibious landing at Inchon were accomplished 17 days after the receipt of the initial directive. E. The 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was disengaged from active combat with the enemy on the South Korean front at midnight on 5 September, moved to Pusan, and outloaded in combat shipping in less than 7 days. F. A successful assault landing was executed at Inchon, Korea on 15 September under some of the most adverse landing conditions in the history of amphibious operations. G. The forced beachhead line approximately 6 miles from landing beaches was seized within 24 hours after the main landing on beaches Red and Blue. H. Kimpo Airfield, a primary objective of the operation in the 1st Marine Division's zone of action, was captured 50 hours and 35 minutes after H hour, D-Day. I. The first assault crossing of the Han River, 400 yards wide at the crossing site, was executed by RCT-5, employing LVTs, DUKWs, and pontoon ferries, less than 5 days after landing at Inchon. J. The remainder of the division crossed the Han River without bridging, and after intense fighting completed the seizure of Seoul 12 days after landing at Inchon. K. The effectiveness of the Marine Air Ground Team and close air support doctrine were reaffirmed with outstanding success. L. The ability of Marine units to participate in extended land operations, provided additional transportation requirements are met during the emergency, was demonstrated in the Inchon-Seoul operation. In any such summary, it is understood that credit for the accomplishments of the 1st Marine Division was shared by the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. 2 more days of fighting remained for the squadrons at Kimpo after the relief of the ground forces, since Marine air operations covered the period from 7 September to 9 October 1950. Altogether, 2,774 combat sorties were flown by the 5 Marine squadrons during this 33-day period, most of them in close support of infantry units. Following are the totals. VMF 214, days in action 16, combat sorties 484. VMF 323, days in action 22, combat sorties 784. VMF 212, days in action 19, combat sorties 607. VMF 312, days in action 10, combat sorties 288. VMF N 542, days in action 19, combat sorties 573. Total combat sorties 2,774. No enemy air operations of any significance were encountered, stated the TAC-10 Corps report. Some enemy anti-aircraft fire from light to moderate was encountered. Most of this AA fire was of small caliber. 11 Marine planes, not counting VM-06 aircraft, were shot down by NKPA ground forces. 6 pilots and a crewman were killed in action and 2 pilots wounded. As an example of the types of missions, The 326 combat sorties flown by VMF 322 fell into these categories: close air support, 163, reconnaissance, 99, rescue cover, 18, deep support, 17, helicopter escort, 8, photo escort, 6, combat air patrol, 6, tactical air control, 4, leaflet, 2, R4D escort, 2, message drop, 2. In addition, the squadron was credited with 151 non-combat sorties. There could be no question that Marine Close Air Support had won the esteem of Army infantry units. Generals Harris and Cushman were the recipients of many spontaneous comments of appreciation from individuals as well as formal endorsements. On the other hand, the Marines had cause to be grateful for the deep support and interdiction strikes provided by the naval fast carrier planes of JTF-7 in combination with the 5th Air Force, which was committed primarily to the support of the 8th Army in South Korea. During the first 2 weeks of September, JTF-7 had responsibility for the gradual isolation of the Inchon target area by means of air operations conducted as far as 150 miles north of the objective and 100 miles to the south. The air defense of our forces at sea and in the Inchon area, and the air interdiction operations of the first 5 or 6 days of the landing, these were carried out largely by naval air effort under Commander JTF-7. Mutual assistance between JTF-7 and the 5th Air Force was provided for, with coordination being achieved by the delineation of areas for each. VMO 6, under the control of the 1st Marine Division and administrative control of MAG 33, completed a total of 643 helicopter and OY flights in 515 hours. Of the 139 seriously wounded men evacuated by helicopter from the firing line, a large proportion owed their lives to the speed and ease with which they were transported to the hospital. The helicopters also were credited with 12 rescue missions of friendly pilots shot down behind the enemy lines. In the long run, of course, it took the coordinated efforts of ground, air, and sea forces to win the final victory in one of the most unusual and difficult amphibious operations of all time. And though this book is limited to an account of Marine activities primarily, the Marines who took part would be first to acknowledge how much the final victory owed to the efforts of other ground forces, the U.S. Army units, the KMC Regiment, and the ROC contingents. Many of these units, like the Marines, had been handicapped by a hasty buildup which allowed little or no time for special training and rehearsals. No greater feat of organization was recorded in 1950 than the creation of the new 7th Infantry Division from the bare bones of the old in only a few weeks. The Marines saw more of the 32nd Infantry than General Barr's other units, for it was this regiment which protected the right flank during critical periods of the advance on Seoul, while elements of the 187th Airborne RCT were responsible for the security of the left flank. The Army artillery units, amphibian tractor troops, and AAA companies also deserved their full share of credit for the victory. And though the Marines were not often in contact with the ROCs, they realized how much these allies had contributed, often under the most adverse circumstances. Naturally, the Marines felt a special interest in the KMC Regiment, which they had trained and equipped. The KMCs repaid this feeling by the valor with which they fought in every phase of the operation from the mopping up of Inchon to the battle for Seoul. The Inchon Landing and its exploitation have been made the subject of a study by officers of the Marine Corps schools at Quantico, who summed up the overall effects as follows. A. The amphibious envelopment at Inchon produced a decisive threat to the North Korean forces which led directly to the rapid disintegration of their front on the Pusan Perimeter. The 1st Marine Division was the landing force in this amphibious envelopment. B. It completed the dislocation of the enemy's entire logistical system by the capture of Seoul, which, together with the combat action of other UN forces, shattered the enemy in all of South Korea, causing the complete rout of the North Korean forces. The 1st Marine Division played a principal role in the capture of Seoul. C. The successful completion of the campaign made available to UN forces the port facilities of Inchon and the extensive Seoul communications complex for carrying offensive action into North Korea. D. By the direct action of the 1st Marine Division, the enemy's potential was reduced by the capture of 4,692 POWs, by inflicting 13,666 casualties on the enemy, by destroying 44 tanks, and by destroying or capturing much other material. In view of such far-reaching results, total casualties for the 1st Marine Division of 366 KIA, 49 DOW, 6 MIA, and 2,029 WIA cannot be considered excessive for an operation fraught with so many calculated risks. No man's life was given in vain, for the communist challenge to the free nations was met in Korea and the aggressors beaten so decisively that the world would soon have had peace except for the intervention of Red China. MacArthur's Report to United Nations. Again, it is worthy to emphasize that the victory was not won by any one nation or any one branch of the military service. As far as this country is concerned, the Inchon-Seoul operation was conducted jointly by the United States Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. General Douglas MacArthur was spokesman for all of them late in September 1950, and these extracts from the 6th report of the Commander-in-Chief, United Nations Command, to the Security Council of the United Nations. Events of the past 2 weeks have been decisive. The strategic concepts designed to win the war are rapidly proving their soundness through aggressive application by our ground, sea, and air forces. The seizure of the heart of the enemy's distributing system in the Seoul area has completely dislocated his logistical supply to his forces in South Korea and has quickly resulted in their disintegration. Caught between our northern and southern forces, both of which are completely self-sustaining because of our absolute air and naval supremacy, the enemy is thoroughly shattered through disruption of his logistical support and our combined combat activities. The prompt junction of our two forces is dramatically symbolic of this collapse. The obstacles to this wide envelopment were not only the enemy opposition, but also the natural obstacles of poor beaches fronted by miles of mudflats, a narrow channel, and an extraordinary tidal range of over 29 feet. The success demonstrated a complete mastery of the technique of amphibious warfare, clockwork coordination, and cooperation between the units and services participating. There was nothing noteworthy about the North Korean opposition, but there could have been. The potential was there. The North Koreans were proceeding with the construction of coastal fortifications, dug-in tanks and guns of all calibers, beach defenses, and mining operations. Had this development been delayed for as much as a month, the enemy would have been ready and the assault, if possible, would have been more costly to the United Nations forces. At no time, not even when the United Nations forces were fighting with their backs to the wall at Pusan, did the Commander-in-Chief ever have any doubts as to the outcome. It was fitting, therefore, that he should have summed up the results of the combined 8th Army and 10 Corps offensives in this conclusion written after the securing of Seoul. A successful frontal attack and envelopment has completely changed the tide of battle in South Korea. The backbone of the North Korean army has been broken, and their scattered forces are being liquidated or driven north, with material losses in equipment and men captured. End of Chapter 14, Part 2. End of U.S. Marine Operations in Korea, 1950 to 1953. Volume 2, The Inchon-Seoul Operation, by Lynn Montross and Nicholas Canzona. Read by Aaron Bennett.